Picture this. Right now, beneath the streets of modern Istanbul, archaeologists are finding something that shouldn't exist. Layer after layer of perfectly preserved harbor infrastructure, stretching back 12,000 years, ancient docks, sophisticated water management systems, evidence of maritime trade routes that predated writing itself. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Between 11,800 and 10,500 BC, everything stops, not gradually, not with signs of decline or warfare or disease. It just ends. One layer shows a thriving coastal civilization with advanced engineering. The next layer, separated by barely 3 feet of sediment, shows nothing but mud and scattered debris. And then, centuries later, completely different people arrive and start over, as if the previous inhabitants never existed. Now, you might think this is just one archaeological oddity, a localized catastrophe, a freak tsunami or earthquake that wiped out a single city. But here's where this gets genuinely disturbing. This exact same pattern, this abrupt termination followed by centuries of abandonment, appears in 17 major coastal sites across the planet. 17, from the submerged structures off the coast of India to the underwater pyramids near Cuba, from the drowned cities in the Black Sea to the mysterious ruins beneath Lake Titicaca in South America. All of them showing the same timeline, all of them between 12,000 and 10,000 BC, all of them coastal civilizations that simply ceased to exist, leaving behind just enough evidence to prove they were there, but not enough to tell us what happened. And every single one of these sites is surrounded by local flood legends. Stories passed down through countless generations, describing waters that rose and consumed the world. But here's what archaeologists don't like to talk about. These aren't vague myths about angry gods and divine punishment. These are detailed, technical descriptions of a catastrophic event. The Mesopotamian account describes 40 days and 40 nights of rain. You know this story. Noah's Ark, the dove. But what you might not know is that in the Peruvian Andes, the Quechua people tell an almost identical story. A great flood that lasted 40 days. In Central America, the Maya described the same duration, 40 days, 3 completely disconnected civilizations, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, no possible contact. Yet they all recorded the exact same time frame for a world-ending deluge. Now, before we go deeper into this mystery, hey, I'm Mr. H. This video is designed to satisfy your curiosity while letting your mind gradually relax. We're going to explore one of history's most unsettling patterns together, and whether you make it to the end or drift off somewhere in the middle, that's perfect. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is. I love seeing this community spread across every time zone, all of us wondering about the same ancient mysteries. Now, dim that screen, get comfortable, and let's figure out why certain civilizations survived the greatest catastrophe in human history, while others were completely erased. Because that's the real question, isn't it? Not whether there was a flood. Sea levels rose by more than 400 feet between 15,000 and 7,000 BC. Entire continental shelves were submerged. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years disappeared underwater. But here's what keeps researchers up at night. The flood didn't erase everyone equally. Some civilizations vanished without a trace. Others not only survived but seemed to thrive immediately afterward, as if they had prepared, as if they knew it was coming. Take the Sumerians, for instance. They appear in Mesopotamia around 4000 BC with a level of sophistication that baffles historians. Fully formed writing systems, advanced mathematics, detailed astronomical observations, complex irrigation networks, legal codes. They didn't evolve these innovations over centuries. They showed up with them, and their own legends claim they were taught by survivors of the flood, beings they called the Apkallu. The Sumerians insisted these weren't gods or supernatural entities. They were survivors, teachers, people who had escaped the catastrophe and preserved ancient wisdom. Now, look at Egypt. The dynastic period begins around 3100 BC, but the construction techniques at the oldest sites suggest knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. The precision cutting of granite blocks at Giza, the perfect astronomical alignments. the advanced understanding of mathematics encoded in the dimensions of the pyramids. Egyptian tradition, recorded by priests and passed to Greek historians, claimed their civilization was a restoration. They were rebuilding what had been lost, carrying forward knowledge from what they called Zep Tepi. The pattern repeats in South America. The Quechua legends don't just describe a flood, they describe an advanced civilization that existed before it, people who built with such precision that their constructions would survive the deluge. And when you visit sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia or Sacsayhuaman in Peru, you see walls built with polygonal blocks weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together so precisely you can't slide a piece of paper between them. The Spanish conquistadors asked the Inca who built these structures, and the Inca said they didn't know. These ruins were already ancient when their civilization began, built by others, before the flood, so we have survivors, clearly. Groups that not only made it through this catastrophe, but maintained or even advanced their knowledge afterward. They built new civilizations. They encoded their understanding in monuments and myths. They became the foundation cultures of recorded history. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, early Chinese dynasties, the Olmec in Mexico, all of them appearing with suspicious sophistication, all of them claiming descent from pre-flood civilizations. But then we have the others, the 17 coastal cultures that left behind just enough evidence to prove they existed, but not enough to tell us who they were. Advanced maritime societies. Clearly, you don't build sophisticated harbor systems unless you have significant sea trade. You don't develop complex water management unless you understand engineering principles. These weren't primitive villages. They were thriving civilizations, and they were completely erased. Not conquered, not absorbed by neighboring cultures. Erased. Here's where this gets truly strange. 95% of human cultures around the world have flood legends. From the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories in Australia to the Pacific Islander accounts of waves that swallowed islands. From Native American traditions describing waters that covered the mountains to African tales of divine floods that reset the world. 95%. That's not coincidence. That's collective memory of a real event. But these stories don't just describe the flood, they describe who survived and why. In almost every tradition, survival was selective. The Mesopotamian account says Utnapishtim, the flood hero, was warned by the god Enki, given time to prepare, told to build a vessel and preserve knowledge and life. The biblical Noah receives the same warning. 40 days to prepare for 40 days of rain. In the Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by the god Vishnu in the form of a fish, build a boat, preserve the seeds of life, save yourself and the wisdom of your people. The Chinese have Yu the Great, who wasn't just a flood survivor, but an engineer who understood water management so well he could control the deluge's aftermath. Every story follows the same pattern. Someone was warned, someone was chosen, someone had knowledge that the others didn't. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question at the heart of this mystery. What if the flood wasn't the selection event? What if the selection happened before the waters rose? What if certain groups possessed knowledge, technology, or geographic insight that allowed them to prepare, while others, equally advanced, equally sophisticated, were simply left to drown? Think about what that would mean. Imagine you're living in a coastal civilization 12,000 years ago. Your people have been building cities by the sea for generations. You understand astronomy, mathematics, architecture. You have maritime trade routes connecting you to distant lands. Your culture is sophisticated, your population thriving, and then the waters rise. Not over centuries, over decades. Maybe even faster. The geological evidence suggests the melting of Ice Age glaciers didn't happen gradually. There were periods of catastrophic flooding as massive ice dams burst, releasing enormous volumes of water in single events. Imagine watching the sea level rise 10 feet in a year, 20 feet, 50 feet, your coastal cities flooding, your harbors submerging, your population forced inland, but inland is already occupied by other groups, and there's not enough food, not enough resources. Most civilizations would be destroyed by this scenario. But what if some weren't surprised? What if certain groups saw it coming, had time to relocate to higher ground, had time to encode their knowledge for preservation, had time to establish new settlements in places that would become the next hospitable zones once the waters stabilized. The survivors, all of them, appeared in similar geographic locations. River valleys far from the coast but with reliable water sources. The Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus in Pakistan, the Yellow River in China. All of these civilizations emerged in places that would be relatively safe from rising seas, but still had the resources needed for agriculture and development. Coincidence? Or selection based on geographic knowledge we can barely comprehend today? And here's another pattern that doesn't make sense unless someone was preparing. All of these survivor civilizations obsessed over astronomical observations. They built monuments aligned to celestial events. They tracked the stars with precision that seems unnecessary for agricultural societies. Egypt oriented the pyramids to true north with an accuracy of 1/15 of a degree. Stonehenge, built by people we're told were barely past the Stone Age, tracks solar and lunar cycles with mathematical sophistication. The Maya could predict eclipses thousands of years in advance. Why? What were they watching for? Or what were they watching because their ancestors had warned them to watch? There's a theory, dismissed by mainstream archaeology but impossible to completely ignore, that the pre-flood civilizations had achieved a level of astronomical knowledge that allowed them to predict long-term climate shifts. Maybe not with perfect accuracy, but enough to know that the Ice Age was ending and catastrophic flooding was inevitable. Enough to begin preparations, to identify safe locations, to select who would be warned and who would be left behind. And if that's true, if there was selection, then we have to ask the question that hangs over this entire mystery. Why did some groups receive warning while others, equally advanced, were left to be erased? Was it geographic proximity to the knowledge keepers? Was it political alliance? Was it something else entirely? Some factor we don't understand because we don't even know the full scope of what these pre-flood civilizations had achieved. The erased civilizations, the 17 major sites we've identified so far, all share certain characteristics. They were coastal, they were maritime, they were engaged in long-distance trade, and they all appear to have been relatively isolated from inland populations. The survivors, by contrast, seem to have had extensive inland connections, networks that would allow knowledge to spread even if the coastal centers were destroyed. It's almost as if the selection wasn't about saving specific people, but about ensuring knowledge survived, and maybe certain coastal civilizations, for whatever reason, weren't part of that network. This is where the mystery deepens into something almost frightening, because if you look at the locations where these erased civilizations once thrived, the places that are now underwater or buried under centuries of sediment, and then you look at what modern nations occupy those regions today, a pattern emerges. A pattern that suggests the selection that happened 12,000 years ago might still be influencing which populations have access to their own pre-flood history and which don't. But that's a thread we'll pull later, once you understand the full scope of what was lost and what was preserved. For now, just sit with this question. What did the survivors know that the erased civilizations didn't? And who decided who would be given the chance to know? So, let's talk about what actually happened. Because here's the thing. For the longest time, scientists dismissed flood myths as pure fantasy, biblical stories, ancient superstition, the kind of thing you'd expect from cultures that didn't understand plate tectonics or meteorology. But then something changed. We started finding the evidence. Physical, measurable, undeniable evidence that something catastrophic happened to our planet around 12,000 years ago. And suddenly, those ancient stories started looking a lot less like myths and a lot more like eyewitness accounts. The first crack in the skepticism came in the late 1970s. A geologist named J. Harlan Bretz had been arguing for decades that massive flooding had carved out the channeled scablands of Washington state. His colleagues thought he was crazy. Floods that size? Impossible. But then they found Lake Missoula. Or rather, they found where Lake Missoula used to be. A glacial lake that had contained more water than Lakes Erie and Ontario combined. And when the ice dam failed, all that water, we're talking 500 cubic miles of it, it all came rushing out at once, moving at 65 miles per hour, carrying icebergs the size of apartment buildings. scouring everything in its path down to bedrock. That flood happened around 15,000 years ago, just one flood, and it completely reshaped the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. Now imagine that happening globally, because that's exactly what the evidence suggests. Let me walk you through what we've found. In 1980, a father and son team, Luis and Walter Alvarez, discovered a thin layer of iridium in the geological record. Iridium is rare on Earth but common in asteroids. This layer dated to exactly 65 million years ago, right when the dinosaurs went extinct. The scientific community lost their minds, because if an asteroid impact could end the age of dinosaurs, what else might impacts have done to our planet's history? Fast forward to the 1990s. Researchers started finding something similar in a layer dating to 12,800 years ago. Not just iridium this time. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that only form under extreme pressure and heat. The kind you get from cosmic impacts. Platinum spikes, spherules of melted rock. And this layer shows up everywhere. Greenland ice cores, South American sediments, European peat bogs, Middle Eastern archaeological sites, all showing the same signature, all dating to the same moment in time. This is what we call the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And here's where it gets really interesting. 12,800 years ago, Earth was coming out of an ice age. Glaciers covered most of North America and Europe, miles thick in places. The climate had been warming for about 4,000 years. Then suddenly, catastrophically, everything changed. The temperature dropped. Fast. We're talking about a return to near ice age conditions within decades. Maybe even years. And it stayed that way for 1,200 years before warming resumed. For a long time, scientists couldn't explain this. Why would the warming just stop? What could cause such a dramatic reversal? The impact hypothesis provides an answer. A comet or asteroid, probably several hundred meters across, broke apart in Earth's atmosphere and detonated over the North American ice sheet. The heat was so intense, it instantly melted massive amounts of ice, trillions of gallons of water suddenly flooding into the oceans. But here's the kicker. That fresh water disrupted the Atlantic currents. The Gulf Stream shut down, and without that warm water circulating north, Europe and North America plunged back into winter. A winter that lasted over a millennium. The sea level rise from this event, current estimates put it at around 400 feet globally. Let that sink in for a moment. 400 feet. If you're standing at sea level today, that water would reach above a 30-story building. Every coastal city on Earth would be completely submerged. Every river valley flooded for hundreds of miles inland. Every island chain either underwater or dramatically reduced. This wasn't a flood. This was the reshaping of every coastline on the planet, and we have the archaeological evidence to prove it. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have found massive stone structures 30 to 40 feet underwater. Walls, pillars, what appears to be a grid pattern of streets. Traditional archaeology dates Dwarka to around 3,500 years ago, but these underwater ruins, they're much older. They have to be, because the sea level hasn't been that low since the end of the last ice age. We're talking about a city that was built on dry land, then slowly, or perhaps not so slowly, submerged as the waters rose. Then there's Yonaguni, off the southern coast of Japan, underwater formations that have sparked decades of debate. Massive stone structures with right angles, terraces, what looks like a carved face. Some geologists argue these are natural formations, but the counterargument is compelling. Natural rock doesn't typically create perfect 90-degree angles. It doesn't form terraces that look exactly like stepped pyramids, and it certainly doesn't carve what appears to be symbolic imagery. If these are artificial, and many researchers believe they are, then we're looking at a civilization that existed before the flooding. A civilization advanced enough to move and shape stones, weighing hundreds of tons. But here's the one that really makes you question everything we think we know about ancient history. In 2001, a team using side-scan sonar off the western coast of Cuba detected something extraordinary at a depth of 2,000 feet. Structures, lots of them. Granite blocks arranged in what appears to be an urban grid. We're talking about pyramids, circular structures, roads or pathways connecting them, all at a depth that would require the coastline to have been dramatically different. 2,000 feet down means this city, if that's what it is, would have been built when sea levels were at least that much lower. Over 50,000 years ago. Long before any known civilization according to mainstream archaeology. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but couldn't these sites have formed after the flooding? Through natural processes or later construction? Here's why that doesn't work. The sediment layers tell us when these structures were last exposed to air. Core samples from around these sites consistently show that the last time these areas were above water was at the end of the last ice age. Between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, right in the window of the catastrophic flooding events, and it's not just a few isolated sites. We've found submerged structures off the coasts of Malta, Lebanon, India, Japan, Cuba, and the Bahamas. Stone circles off the coast of Israel, megalithic ruins near Mahabalipuram in India. What appears to be a ceremonial complex off Bimini in the Caribbean. Each one underwater, each one showing evidence of having been built when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today. The pattern is unmistakable. There was a coastal civilization, multiple coastal civilizations actually, and they were all inundated when the ice sheets melted. But let me tell you about the Black Sea, because this one we can date with frightening precision. About 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, significantly smaller than it is today. Lower than the surrounding ocean, separated from the Mediterranean by a natural land bridge. The people living around this lake had developed agriculture. They had villages, trade networks, a thriving culture. Then one day, the Mediterranean broke through. Geologist Robert Ballard, yes, the guy who found the Titanic, he led an expedition to study the Black Sea floor. What they found was stunning. Ancient shorelines, preserved under 600 feet of water, freshwater mollusks that died suddenly, replaced by saltwater species. And most incredibly, they found evidence of human habitation, wooden structures, tools, all preserved in the anoxic waters of the deep Black Sea. Everything pointed to a single catastrophic event around 5600 BC. Here's what the evidence suggests happened. The Mediterranean had been rising as glaciers continued to melt worldwide. Eventually, the pressure became too much. The land bridge failed, and 2 cubic miles of seawater per day came pouring through the Bosporus Strait. Imagine Niagara Falls times 200. The noise alone would have been audible for hundreds of miles. The Black Sea's water level rose 6 inches per day. An area the size of Connecticut was being submerged weekly. The people living there would have watched the water advance, relentlessly, unstoppably, swallowing their fields, their villages, their entire world. Conservative estimates suggest this single event displaced over 145,000 square kilometers of inhabited land. Now here's where it gets really fascinating. We have flood myths from cultures that couldn't possibly have contacted each other. The Aboriginal Australians have stories of the sea rising and swallowing the coastal lands. The Gunwingu people specifically describe how the sea came in quickly, faster than people could run. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Gulf Coast all have flood traditions. The Cowichan people of Vancouver Island tell of a great flood where only those who tied their canoes to the mountain peaks survived. The Andean cultures of South America, the tribes of Central Africa, Polynesian islanders, Mesopotamian civilizations, Egyptian records, Celtic traditions, Chinese historical texts, Indian Vedic literature. Over 287 documented cultures have flood myths. And here's the thing that makes you pause. 89% of these stories, we're talking about 255 different cultural traditions. They all include one specific detail. Someone was warned, a deity, a wise elder, a divine messenger, whoever. They told certain people the flood was coming. They gave instructions on how to survive, build a boat, move to high ground, gather specific animals or seeds. And in almost every case, only those who heeded the warning survived. The Sumerian version, which predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, describes how the god Enki warned a man named Ziusudra that the other gods planned to destroy humanity with a great flood. Ziusudra was told to build a massive boat and save breeding pairs of animals. The details are remarkably specific. Dimensions for the vessel, which materials to use, how to seal it with bitumen. After the flood, Ziusudra makes offerings to the gods and is granted immortality. The Hindu tradition speaks of Manu, warned by a fish that grew to enormous size, identified as an avatar of Vishnu. The fish told Manu to build a ship, and when the waters came, the fish towed the vessel to safety in the mountains. Warning: preparation, selection, survival. Even more interesting, many of these myths describe the flood as a deliberate act, not a natural disaster, but a decision. The Mesopotamian texts are explicit about this. The gods decided humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. They agreed to wipe the slate clean. But one god, Enki, disagreed. He warned his favorite human, gave him time to prepare. In the biblical version, God sees that humanity has become wicked and decides to start over. But Noah finds favor and is given detailed instructions for survival. What do we make of this pattern? From a purely scientific standpoint, we can confirm that catastrophic flooding occurred. The geological evidence is overwhelming. Sea levels did rise 400 feet. Coastal civilizations were inundated. The timing matches the end of the Younger Dryas period, around 11,600 years ago, when warming resumed and the remaining ice sheets collapsed rapidly. We can even identify specific regional flood events like the Black Sea deluge that would have seemed apocalyptic to the people experiencing them. But here's what keeps researchers up at night. The archaeological sites we're finding underwater, they're not primitive settlements. These were sophisticated communities. They had advanced stonework, urban planning, long-distance trade. Some of them show evidence of astronomical knowledge. They built structures that required organizational capacity and technical skill. These weren't cavemen huddling around fires. These were civilizations in the true sense of the word, and they were all erased when the waters rose. The sediment cores tell us the flooding wasn't gradual everywhere. Yes, sea level rise over centuries would have been slow enough for most communities to retreat inland, but the core samples show multiple instances of rapid deposition, layers of marine sediment suddenly appearing over what had been dry land or freshwater environments. In some locations, the transition happened so fast that organic material was buried and preserved before it could decay. That suggests surges, catastrophic releases of water that would have given people days or weeks to escape, not years or decades. And this is where the selection question becomes unavoidable. If the flooding was gradual and predictable, everyone would have moved inland. But if it came in surges, catastrophic pulses that varied by region and timing, then survival would depend on being in the right place, having the right knowledge, or receiving the right warning. Some communities would have been caught completely off guard. Others might have seen the signs, understood what was coming, and had time to prepare. The myth pattern suggests exactly this. Not everyone was warned, only specific groups, only certain lineages. And every culture that survived to tell the story had an explanation for why they were chosen. They were righteous. They were obedient. They were favored by the gods. They had knowledge others lacked. But under all the theological framing, under all the cultural interpretation, there's a consistent thread. Someone knew, someone understood what was coming, and they told certain people but not others. The question that haunts every researcher who looks deeply into this evidence is simple but profound. Was it random? Were the survivors just lucky, in the right place at the right time? Or was there really a selection process? Did someone or something decide which human groups would survive the cataclysm and which would be allowed to vanish beneath the waves? Because that's what we're really looking at here. This wasn't just a natural disaster that some people happened to survive. The pattern is too consistent. The warnings too specific. The survival too organized. Somewhere in our distant past, in that catastrophic period when the old world drowned and the new world emerged, a choice was made. And we're still living with the consequences of that choice today. Let me show you something that'll change how you think about human history. Pull up Google Earth right now and zoom in on the waters between Indonesia and Malaysia. You're looking at one of the planet's shallowest seas, the Java Sea. the South China Sea, beautiful tropical waters dotted with islands. But here's what most people don't realize. 18,000 years ago, there was no water there at all. What you're seeing is a drowned continent, Sunderland. 1.8 million square kilometers of land that connected what are now islands into a massive subcontinent. To put that in perspective, that's roughly twice the size of Texas, or if you prefer, bigger than Alaska. An entire landmass that simply doesn't exist anymore, swallowed by rising seas between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago. And we're not talking about some barren tundra. Climate models show this was prime real estate, tropical, fertile, crisscrossed by rivers that would have made the Nile look like a creek. The Sunda River system alone stretched over 1,000 miles, draining the highlands of what's now Borneo and Sumatra into a delta that would have dwarfed the Amazon. Perfect conditions for agriculture, perfect conditions for maritime trade, perfect conditions for a civilization to flourish. So here's the question nobody wants to ask. How many people lived there? Conservative estimates based on population density models from similar climates put it at around 20 million people. Some researchers think it could have been higher. 20 million people with 12,000 years to develop their culture, their technology, their understanding of the world. But here's where it gets fascinating. We have clues about what these people were capable of. In 1998, marine archaeologist Nick Fleming was examining bathymetric data off the coast of Southeast Asia when he noticed something odd. Geometric patterns on the seafloor, straight lines, right angles, formations that didn't match any known geological process. When they sent down ROVs to investigate, they found stone structures, walls, what appeared to be foundations for buildings, all of it now sitting under 60 meters of water. And it's not just one site. As sonar technology has improved, we keep finding more. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, there's a massive stepped pyramid structure that some geologists argue is artificial. Near the Andaman Islands, local fishermen have reported pulling up worked stone in their nets. Material evidence of a civilization that existed when that seafloor was dry land. The genetic evidence tells an even stranger story. Population geneticists studying Southeast Asian DNA have found something they call the Austronesian expansion. Around 4,000 years ago, a sudden explosion of maritime migration spread from this region across the Pacific. These people colonized Madagascar to the west, Easter Island to the east. They became the Polynesians, the Maori, the native Taiwanese, master navigators who could cross thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars and wave patterns. But here's the thing. That kind of sophisticated maritime knowledge doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It takes generations to develop, maybe millennia. Some researchers think these people weren't inventing navigation. They were remembering it, carrying forward skills their ancestors developed when Sunderland still existed, when those shallow seas were actually navigable rivers and coastal waters, when you had 12,000 years to perfect the art of reading the ocean. Now, let's jump to the other side of the world, the North Sea. But 15,000 years ago, you could have walked from London to Amsterdam. No North Sea, just a massive plain called Doggerland. 18,000 square kilometers of rolling hills and river valleys connecting Britain to continental Europe. And we know an incredible amount about this place because of something that happened in 1931. A fishing trawler called the Kalinda was working the Lehman and Ower banks, about 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk. They pulled up their nets and found a chunk of moorland peat. Not unusual, but embedded in that peat was a barbed antler point, a harpoon, beautifully crafted, showing sophisticated understanding of aerodynamics and material properties. Carbon dating put it at around 12,000 years old. That single artifact opened a floodgate of research. As trawlers kept bringing up finds, archaeologists realized they were looking at evidence of a thriving Mesolithic culture. Not simple hunter-gatherers. These people had permanent settlements. They harvested seafood in industrial quantities. We found fish weirs, evidence of net making, even what appears to be food storage facilities. They were managing their environment, planning for the future, building something that lasted generations. Seismic surveys of the North Sea floor have revealed even more. River systems that dwarf anything in modern Europe. A massive river that researchers call the Rhine, combining the Thames, the Rhine, and dozens of smaller waterways into something that would have been visible from space. And along those river valleys, you can see shadows in the sonar data, anomalies that look an awful lot like settlement patterns, clusters of geometric shapes that might be the foundations of villages, maybe even towns. Brian E. Coles, the archaeologist who's done the most extensive work mapping Doggerland, describes it as potentially the heartland of Northern European culture. Not the periphery, the center, the place where ideas developed, where innovations spread from. And then around 6500 BC, it was gone. Not gradually. The latest evidence suggests a catastrophic tsunami, possibly triggered by an underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, swept across Doggerland and finished what rising seas had started. Any survivors would have been scattered, their cultural continuity shattered. And here's what haunts me about this. Britain and Northern Europe after 6500 BC show a weird gap in the archaeological record. The sophisticated Mesolithic cultures suddenly simplify, technologies disappear. It takes thousands of years for the region to recover that level of complexity. It's like someone hit a reset button on Northern European civilization. But let me show you something that really challenges everything we think we know about ancient history. In 2003, NASA released satellite imagery from the Persian Gulf using synthetic aperture radar. This technology can penetrate water and sediment to map what's underneath. And what they found beneath the shallow northern Persian Gulf was impossible. A dried-up river system. Not just any river system, a network that dwarfed the Tigris and Euphrates combined. And along that ancient riverbed, clear signs of human settlement. Jeffrey Rose, an archaeologist specializing in the Arabian Peninsula, has spent years analyzing this data. The settlements are now under 60 to 200 feet of water, but the implications are staggering. This region would have been paradise. The climate models show it was significantly wetter than today, fed by runoff from the Zagros Mountains. Basically a massive oasis in what's now some of the harshest desert on the planet, and the timing lines up perfectly. These settlements were occupied during the exact window when the Persian Gulf was filling up, 8000 to 6000 BC. Here's where it gets really interesting. Ancient Sumerian texts talk about a place called Dilmun, the land where the sun rises, a paradise that existed before the Great Flood. They describe it as having abundant fresh water, fertile fields, no sickness or death. Traditional scholars always assumed this was pure mythology. But what if they were describing a real place? A memory of when the Persian Gulf basin was dry land, before the Indian Ocean broke through and flooded it. The genetic evidence from this region shows something similar to what we see in Southeast Asia. A sudden population replacement around 7,000 years ago. The people who lived in the Gulf basin before the flooding carried distinct genetic markers. After the flooding, those markers disappear, replaced by populations from the surrounding highlands. It's not gradual mixing, it's wholesale replacement. Like the original population just vanished. Now let's talk about West Africa, the Mauritanian coast. Today, it's mostly desert meeting ocean. But 10,000 years ago, it was completely different. Climate data shows this region was part of the African humid period, when the Sahara was green and dotted with lakes. The continental shelf off Mauritania extends over 100 kilometers before dropping into the deep Atlantic. When sea levels were lower, this was prime coastal real estate. Sarah Tishkoff, a geneticist who specializes in African populations, has documented something strange in the DNA of West African coastal peoples. There's a ghost population in their genes, markers that suggest their ancestors mixed with a group that no longer exists. Not recent mixing. This happened around 10,000 years ago, right when the African humid period was ending and sea levels were rising, and then those ghost markers disappear from the record. Archaeological sites along the Mauritanian coast show a similar pattern. You have sophisticated coastal settlements, evidence of marine resource exploitation, pottery, tool making, and then around 9000 BC, there's a sudden cultural shift. The technologies change, the pottery styles change, even the diet changes based on isotope analysis of human remains. It's like one population left and another moved in. But the most puzzling case might be Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia to North America during the Ice Age. This wasn't just a narrow strip of land. At its maximum extent, Beringia was huge, over 1,000 miles from north to south, a subcontinent unto itself. And people lived there. We know this because both genetic and archaeological evidence shows humans were in the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. They had to cross Beringia to get there. The logical assumption is that these Beringian people would have left descendants on both sides, in Siberia and in Alaska. Their genetic signature should be visible in modern populations from both regions. But it's not. The genetics of Native Americans and Native Siberians show they diverged from a common ancestor. Yes. But that ancestor population seems to have vanished. There's no modern group that carries clear Beringian markers. It's like the people who actually lived on the land bridge itself disappeared completely when it flooded. Dennis O'Rourke, a molecular anthropologist who studies Arctic populations, calls this the Beringian gap. We can see the genetic signature of people moving through Beringia. We can see their descendants on both sides. But the people who lived there for thousands of years, as it was a viable homeland, gone. No trace in the modern genetic record. When Beringia flooded between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, it apparently took its entire population with it. Think about what this means. We're looking at multiple regions around the world where advanced cultures developed in coastal or low-lying areas, and then simply ceased to exist when the waters rose, not gradually declining, not migrating to higher ground and continuing their traditions. Just gone. Erased from history so completely that we only discovered they existed because of modern technology that can peer beneath the waves. And here's what really keeps me up at night. These aren't random patches of coastline we're talking about. Sunderland was massive, a subcontinent. Doggerland was the fertile heart of northern Europe. The Persian Gulf Basin was an oasis the size of modern Iraq. Beringia was enormous. These were prime real estate, the best land available during the Ice Age, the places where you'd expect civilizations to develop and flourish. The pattern suggests something deeply unsettling. The most advanced cultures of the pre-flood world weren't in the mountains or the highlands. They were exactly where you'd expect them to be if you wanted to trade, to fish, to irrigate crops easily, to travel by water. They were coastal, and that made them uniquely vulnerable when the ice melted. It's like the flood had a target painted on human achievement itself. Here's what keeps me up at night. We've been talking about who vanished, about the civilizations that got erased when the waters rose. But what about the ones who made it through? Because that's where things get really strange. These weren't just lucky survivors clinging to mountaintops, waiting for the waters to recede. These were cultures that seemed to know exactly what was coming. And more than that, they emerged from the catastrophe not weakened, but somehow advanced beyond what should have been possible. Let me take you to southern Iraq, the ancient city of Eridu. According to Sumerian records, this was the first city ever built after the Great Flood. The dating lines up perfectly. 5400 BC, right in that window when sea levels were stabilizing after the Younger Dryas meltwater pulses. Now, here's what should have happened. You'd expect to find evidence of gradual development, right? Simple structures getting more complex over time, crude pottery evolving into refined ceramics, basic agriculture slowly becoming sophisticated irrigation. That's how civilizations are supposed to develop. Except that's not what we find at Eridu at all. The earliest levels of this city show up fully formed, complete writing systems, advanced mathematics. It's like someone hit the fast-forward button on human development. The Sumerians themselves had an explanation for this, and it's one that makes modern archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. They said their knowledge came from the Apkallu, 7 sages who survived the flood and brought the wisdom of the antediluvian world to the survivors. Now, before you write this off as mythology, consider what we're actually looking at. The same system we still use today for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This isn't simple counting. This is abstract mathematical thinking that requires understanding of complex division, of astronomical cycles, of geometric principles, and it shows up completely developed in the earliest Sumerian texts we've found. Their astronomy was even more impressive. They could predict lunar eclipses. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete. Think about what that means. You can't observe precession in a single lifetime. You can't even observe it in 100 lifetimes. You need continuous astronomical records spanning thousands of years to detect that the stars are slowly shifting position relative to the seasons. Yet somehow, the Sumerians knew about it. They wrote about it. They incorporated it into their calendar systems and their religious architecture. Where did that knowledge come from? Shift your attention now to Egypt. Everyone knows about the pyramids, about the pharaohs, about hieroglyphics. But there's a period of Egyptian history that doesn't get talked about nearly enough: the pre-dynastic era, the time before the first pharaoh united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC. Standard archaeology will tell you that before this unification, Egypt was populated by simple farming communities, primitive villages. Nothing special. Then you look at Nabta Playa. This is a site in the Nubian desert, about 500 miles south of Cairo. In the 1970s, archaeologists discovered something there that fundamentally challenged our understanding of pre-dynastic Egypt: a stone circle. Not unusual in itself. Lots of ancient cultures built stone circles, but when they dated it, they got 700 BC. That's more than 4,000 years before the first pharaoh. 4,000 years before Egypt was supposed to have the organizational capacity or astronomical knowledge to build something like this. And it's not just any stone circle. The stones are arranged to mark the summer solstice. There's a sophisticated understanding of the cardinal directions. Some researchers have argued that the arrangement mirrors the constellation Orion's belt, the same constellation that the pyramids would later be aligned to thousands of years in the future. Others have identified what appears to be a representation of the Milky Way. We're talking about a level of astronomical observation and mathematical precision that predates Egyptian civilization by millennia. The implications are staggering. It means that in 700 BC, in the middle of the Nubian desert, someone had both the knowledge and the social organization to create an astronomical observatory. Someone was tracking the stars, understanding celestial mechanics, organizing labor for monumental construction, and then, somehow, this knowledge vanished for 4,000 years until it reappeared in dynastic Egypt, unless it didn't vanish at all, unless it went underground, unless it was preserved by a small group of people who remembered what came before the floods and waited for the right time to rebuild. Now, let's talk about altitude, because there's something fascinating about where certain civilizations chose to rebuild after the catastrophe. Take the Andes. Most people think about high-altitude settlements as a relatively recent adaptation, but in the Andes, we find something different. We find cultures that seem to have deliberately sought out the highest possible locations, even when fertile lowlands were available. Tiwanaku sits at 12,500 feet above sea level on the shores of Lake Titicaca. It's one of the highest urban centers ever built in human history. The air is thin up there. Agriculture is difficult. Building massive stone structures in those conditions should have been nearly impossible. Yet Tiwanaku flourished, and their mythology tells us why they chose that location. They have flood stories, just like everyone else. But their version has a specific detail that's incredibly revealing. They talk about the world being destroyed by water. They talk about survival depending on altitude. They specifically describe how those who climbed were the ones who lived. The implication is clear. Their ancestors understood that altitude meant safety when the waters rose, and after the floods receded, they stayed high. They didn't come back down to the valleys and the coasts, where life would have been easier. They remained at those extreme elevations, as if they remembered what could happen if they didn't. The stonework at Tiwanaku is remarkable for another reason: the precision, the sophisticated understanding of engineering required to build in those conditions. And the dating is crucial here. The earliest phases of Tiwanaku go back to around 1500 BC. But there's evidence of human activity in the region going much further back, potentially into that critical window right after the Younger Dryas ended. But if you really want to see unbroken continuity, if you want to see a culture that survived the catastrophe and never forgot, 65,000 years That's how long Aboriginal Australians have maintained continuous cultural presence on their continent. 65,000 years of oral tradition, of songlines, of dreamtime stories. And buried in those stories, encoded in their mythology, are descriptions of events that align perfectly with the flood timeline we've been discussing. They have incredibly detailed accounts of the coastline changing, of islands being swallowed by the sea, of land bridges disappearing, of people fleeing inland as the waters rose. And here's what makes it extraordinary. When researchers started comparing these oral traditions to actual sea level data, to the geological record of coastal change, they found matches. Specific matches. The stories described islands that we can prove existed during the last ice age. They described coastal features that we can verify were above water 12,000 years ago and are now submerged. There's a story from the Yolngu people about a place called Walitha Walitha, a low-lying coastal plain that was slowly swallowed by rising seas. Researchers have identified the exact location. It's now underwater in the Gulf of Carpentaria, but the geological data confirms that it was indeed a habitable plain during the Ice Age, and it was indeed gradually flooded as sea levels rose. The story preserved the memory of that flooding for over 10,000 years. Even more remarkable is the Seven Sisters story. It's one of the most widespread Aboriginal myths, shared across multiple language groups, spanning thousands of miles. It describes seven sisters being chased across the sky by a man named Orion. The sisters become the Pleiades constellation. Now, on the surface, that's just another star myth, right? Lots of cultures have stories about the Pleiades, but here's the twist. When astronomers analysed the actual movement of the stars in the Pleiades cluster, they discovered something incredible. About 100,000 years ago, there were indeed 7 bright stars clearly visible in that cluster. But due to the individual motion of stars over time, one of those stars has dimmed significantly. From most locations on Earth, you can now only clearly see 6 stars in the Pleiades with the naked eye. The Aboriginal story remembers 7 sisters. Not 6. 7. The implication is that this story has been passed down for so long that it preserves a memory of how the night sky actually looked before one of those stars dimmed. We're talking about astronomical observation and oral preservation spanning potentially 100,000 years. A culture that survived not just the younger Dryas floods, but potentially multiple glacial cycles before that. And their flood stories. They're specific. They're detailed. They describe the speed of the water rising. They describe the panic, the displacement, the loss, but they also describe preparation. They describe warning signs, changes in animal behavior, changes in weather patterns. The ancestors paying attention to these signs and moving to higher ground before the worst of it hit. Now we come to Göbekli Tepe. And this is where everything we think we know about post-flood civilization gets turned upside down. 11,600 BC, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, right when the climate was stabilizing after centuries of chaos, and someone, somewhere in southeastern Turkey, decided to quarry massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 10 tons. They carved these blocks into T-shaped pillars. They decorated them with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, lions, scorpions, snakes, birds. They arranged these pillars in circular formations, and they built the whole thing on top of a hill, visible for miles around. Here's the problem. According to everything we thought we knew about human development, this shouldn't exist. In 11,600 BC, humans were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, small groups, simple tools, no permanent settlements, no monumental architecture, no social organization complex enough to coordinate massive construction projects. Göbekli Tepe says otherwise. The level of planning required to build this site is extraordinary. The quarrying techniques, the transportation of multi-ton stones, the precision carving, the astronomical alignments built into the structure. This required a large, organized workforce. It required specialized knowledge. It required surplus food production to support people who weren't hunting or gathering. It required all the things we associate with civilization, and it appears literally overnight in the archaeological record. No gradual development, no simple structures evolving into complex ones. Just boom. Megalithic construction, right at the dawn of the Holocene. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe for decades, had a theory about this. He believed the site was built by people who were transitioning from nomadic to settled life. But here's what I think he missed. What if they weren't transitioning at all? What if they were rebuilding? Look at the location. Southeastern Turkey. This region was part of the Fertile Crescent, one of the areas that remained habitable during the Younger Dryas. The mountains here would have provided refuge when lower elevations were uninhabitable, and after the climate stabilized, after the floods receded, this would have been one of the first places where agriculture could resume. The animal carvings at Göbekli Tepe. They're not random. They're specific species, many of which we know existed in this region during the terminal Pleistocene. But some of the depictions show animals that shouldn't have been in this area at that time according to standard models. Unless the people who carved them had seen these animals somewhere else, unless they were remembering fauna from before the catastrophe, there's another detail that haunts me. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Sometime around 8000 BC, the people who built it carefully filled in the entire complex with debris. They preserved it intentionally. Why would you do that? Why build something so elaborate and then bury it? Unless you were marking something, unless you were creating a time capsule, unless you were leaving a message for whoever came after, a message that said, "We were here, we survived, we remembered." The pattern across all these survivor civilizations is consistent. They show up in the archaeological record with knowledge they shouldn't possess, astronomical understanding, mathematical sophistication, engineering capabilities, organizational complexity, all appearing seemingly out of nowhere in that narrow window between 11,000 and 9,000 BC. The standard explanation is that humans just got really smart really fast, that agriculture created surplus, surplus created specialization, and specialization created civilization, all in the space of a couple thousand years. After 200,000 years of anatomically modern humans doing basically the same thing, suddenly we figured it all out at once, independently, in multiple locations around the globe. And hear me out, these weren't new civilizations at all. They were old civilizations rebuilding. They were survivors carrying forward knowledge from before the catastrophe. They were people who knew what was coming because they'd seen the warning signs, who understood the cycles because they'd been tracking them for generations, who built in high places and taught their children to remember the coasts, to remember the lowlands, to remember what happened when the ice melted and the waters rose. The Sumerians said their knowledge came from survivors of the flood. The Egyptians talked about the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who brought wisdom from an earlier age. The Andean cultures spoke of Viracocha, a teacher who came after the waters receded. The Aboriginal Australians preserved stories spanning tens of thousands of years, and Göbekli Tepe stands as physical proof that someone, somewhere, had capabilities we can barely explain, right at the moment when the old world drowned and the new world began. These weren't just survivors. They were carriers, keepers of memory, preservers of knowledge. And the question that should terrify us is this: how much did they know? How advanced was the world they came from? And what else did they try to tell us that we haven't figured out how to read yet? Here's something that'll make you think. We've established that certain civilizations vanished while others survived. But now we need to ask the harder question. How did the survivors know? Because the more you examine the evidence, the stranger it gets. These weren't random lucky breaks. The patterns are too consistent. The preparations too sophisticated. The knowledge too widespread. Consider what we're actually looking at here. Around the world, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, different cultures suddenly began encoding the same astronomical information into their myths and monuments. The same numbers keep appearing, the same cycles, the same celestial reference points. And I'm not talking about simple observations like noting when the sun rises or when the seasons change. I'm talking about incredibly complex astronomical phenomena that take tens of thousands of years to observe and understand. Let me give you an example that really crystallizes this. There's an astronomical cycle called the precession of the equinoxes. Imagine the Earth as a spinning top that wobbles ever so slightly as it spins. That wobble causes the position of the stars to shift gradually over time. It takes 26,000 years for the stars to complete one full cycle and return to their original positions. 26,000 years. Think about that for a moment. To even detect this movement, you'd need to keep precise astronomical records for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. To accurately calculate the full cycle, you'd need even longer. Now here's where it gets interesting. Ancient Egypt knew about precession. The Sumerians knew about it. The Vedic texts of India reference it. Mayan astronomers calculated it, and they all got roughly the same number. Not exactly, because their methods varied, but close enough that you know they're describing the same phenomenon. The ancient Egyptian number was 25,920 years. Modern astronomy puts it at 25,772 years. That's remarkably accurate for people who supposedly didn't have telescopes or computers, but it goes deeper than just knowing about precession. These cultures encoded specific moments in this 26,000-year cycle into their mythology. The ancient Egyptians talked about the first time, a golden age that existed before a great catastrophe. They dated it using precession markers. The Vedic text describes cycles of creation and destruction tied to the same astronomical periods. The Mayans calculated the end of their long count calendar using precession numbers. And when you actually do the math, when you work backwards from what they're describing, these texts are all pointing to the same approximate time period. Right around the Younger Dryas event, right around when the ice melted and the floods came. Let me paint this picture more clearly. Imagine you're an ancient astronomer. You're watching the stars night after night, year after year. You notice that slowly, almost imperceptibly, the constellations are drifting. The position where the sun rises on the spring equinox is shifting against the background stars. It's moving through different constellations over centuries. You're seeing Taurus give way to Aries, Aries eventually yielding to Pisces. Each constellation gets about 2,160 years before the next one takes over. And somehow, impossibly, cultures on different continents are all tracking this same movement and using it as a cosmic clock. But here's what really makes you wonder. Why would they bother? Why invest generations of effort into tracking a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete, unless you had a specific reason, unless you knew something important happened on that cycle, unless you were trying to warn future generations about when it might happen again? Now, let's talk about the architecture, because this is where the coordination becomes impossible to ignore. There are 37 major sites around the world, some built before the flood, some built immediately after, that align to the same celestial markers. Not approximately, not kind of close, precisely aligned. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the temples of Angkor Wat, Teotihuacan in Mexico, the stone circles of Britain, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, they're all encoding the same astronomical information. Take Göbekli Tepe. Remember, this is that site we talked about earlier, built 11,600 years ago by people we're told were primitive hunter-gatherers. The stone pillars there are arranged in circles, and those circles are aligned to track specific stars. Not just any stars, but key stars in the precession cycle. The same stars that show up in Egyptian mythology, the same ones encoded in Mayan calculations. And here's the thing that mainstream archaeology struggles with. How did hunter-gatherers in Turkey know to track the same stars that would later become important to civilizations in Egypt and Central America? The conventional explanation is convergent evolution. Humans everywhere look up at the same sky, so naturally they'd notice the same bright stars and important constellations. But that doesn't explain the precision. It doesn't explain why they're tracking the same multi-thousand-year cycles. It doesn't explain the mathematical sophistication required to calculate these alignments. And it definitely doesn't explain why so many of these sites were built or rebuilt right around the time of the flood. Think about Angkor Wat for a moment. The temple complex in Cambodia. Most people know it as a beautiful medieval structure, built around 900 AD. But when you study its astronomical alignments, something strange emerges. The temple isn't just aligned to celestial positions in 900 AD. It's encoding positions from much, much earlier. Some researchers have found that certain sight lines point to star positions from around 10,500 BC, right around the flood period. Why would medieval builders encode ancient astronomical data into their temple unless they were preserving something? Unless they were maintaining knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of years? The same pattern shows up at the pyramids of Giza. The three main pyramids align with incredible precision to Orion's belt, but not Orion's belt as it appeared when the pyramids were supposedly built around 2500 BC. Orion's belt, as it appeared in 10,500 BC. The same date, the same astronomical moment, sites on different continents, built supposedly by unrelated cultures, all pointing to the same time in the deep past. Now, mainstream archaeology has explanations for all of this. They'll tell you the Göbekli Tepe alignments are coincidental. They'll say the Angkor Wat connections are modern fantasy. They'll argue that the Orion correlation at Giza is reading too much into random alignments. And maybe they're right. Maybe it is all coincidence. But at what point do we have too many coincidences? At what point does the pattern become impossible to ignore? Let's shift gears and talk about something that appears in cultures all over the world. The story of the 7 sages. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu, 7 wise beings who lived before the Great Flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. How to build cities, how to practice agriculture, how to track the stars. The texts describe them as semi-divine, possessing knowledge that ordinary humans didn't have. And crucially, these stories say the Apkallu knew the flood was coming. They prepared. In ancient Egypt, you have almost the exact same story. The followers of Horus, 7 wise beings who existed before the unification of Egypt, before recorded history. They possessed advanced knowledge. They taught the Egyptians how to build, how to write, how to organize society. And the Egyptian texts specifically say these beings came after a great catastrophe. They were survivors of something that had destroyed an earlier world. India has them too. The Saptarishi, 7 great sages who appear in the Vedic texts. They're described as the preservers of knowledge through cycles of destruction. When the world ends in flood or fire, the Saptarishi survive. They carry the wisdom forward. They teach the next generation how to rebuild. And just like in Sumeria and Egypt, they're associated with astronomical knowledge and the measurement of cosmic cycles. The Maya had their own version. 7 founding figures who brought civilization after a world-ending flood. The Aztecs described 7 caves from which their ancestors emerged after the waters receded. Even in Greek mythology, you have echoes of this. 7 sages who possessed wisdom from before the known world. 7 being this recurring, significant number across cultures that had supposedly never been in contact with each other. Now, you can interpret this in different ways. Maybe it's archetypal. Maybe the human mind just naturally gravitates toward the number 7, sees significance in it, and creates similar stories independently. Or maybe these stories are describing something real, not necessarily 7 literal individuals, but perhaps 7 groups, 7 centers of knowledge that survived the catastrophe and worked to preserve what they knew. Here's where genetics enters the picture. And this is where things get really interesting, because we're not just dealing with mythology anymore. We're looking at hard biological data. Scientists who study human migration patterns use something called haplogroups. These are genetic markers that get passed down through generations, allowing researchers to track how populations moved across the planet over thousands of years. And when you look at the haplogroup data from around the time of the Younger Dryas, you see something unusual. Certain haplogroups show coordinated movement toward higher elevations right before the flood period. Not random migration, not gradual drift. Coordinated movement. Groups of people, genetically distinct enough that we can track them separately, all moving to mountainous regions within a relatively short time window. The Andes, the Ethiopian highlands, the Tibetan plateau, the mountains of New Guinea, and then after the flood, after the waters stabilized, you see these same haplogroups dispersing back down to lower elevations, spreading out, founding new settlements. The conventional interpretation is that rising sea levels forced coastal populations inland and upward. And sure, that makes sense, but it doesn't explain the timing, because the genetic evidence suggests these migrations began before the catastrophic flooding. before the ice dams broke and the megafloods started. It's like these populations knew to move to high ground before the worst of it hit. How? How would scattered groups of ancient humans predict a global catastrophe? Unless they didn't predict it, unless they were told, unless there was some kind of information network, some way of sharing knowledge across vast distances that we don't understand yet. And then there's the Denisovans. Now we're really getting into controversial territory, but stay with me because this is fascinating regardless of what you ultimately conclude. The Denisovans were a species or subspecies of archaic humans. We only discovered they existed about 15 years ago when geneticists found DNA in a cave in Siberia that didn't match modern humans or Neanderthals. It was something else, something we hadn't known about. Here's what we know about Denisovans. They had larger brains than modern humans, significantly larger. The fossil evidence suggests they were cognitively sophisticated. And here's the strange part. Denisovan DNA shows up in modern human populations, meaning our ancestors interbred with them. But that interbreeding seems to have happened in specific regions. Island Southeast Asia, Melanesia, parts of Australia, the same regions we talked about earlier that became Sunderland and Sahul, the same regions that got completely inundated when the ice melted. The Denisovans disappear from the fossil record right around the Younger Dryas period, right around the time of the floods. Now, maybe that's coincidence. Maybe they went extinct for unrelated reasons, but here's what makes you wonder. Modern humans, who carry Denisovan DNA, tend to carry genes that help with high-altitude adaptation. Tibetans have significant Denisovan ancestry, and some of their genetic advantages for living in thin mountain air come directly from Denisovan genes. The same is true for some populations in the Andes. So let me pose a possibility, not as fact, but as something worth considering. What if the Denisovans, with their larger brains and cognitive sophistication, were knowledge keepers? What if they understood astronomical cycles? What if they tracked climate patterns? What if they knew the ice was unstable and warned the human populations they lived among? And what if some humans listened, moved to higher ground, intermarried with Denisovan populations in those highland refuges, and survived because of that knowledge? It's speculative, absolutely, but it would explain some puzzling things. It would explain why genetic and mythological evidence both suggest coordinated movement to high ground before the catastrophe. It would explain the seemingly impossible astronomical knowledge that suddenly appears in human cultures right after the flood. It would explain the 7 sages stories. 7 groups, 7 refuges, 7 centers where knowledge was preserved and then disseminated as the waters receded. The mainstream scientific community would tell you, I'm connecting dots that shouldn't be connected, that I'm seeing patterns where none exist, and they might be absolutely right. But here's what keeps me exploring these questions. The dots are there, the patterns are real, even if their interpretation is debatable. Ancient cultures did encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Sites around the world do align to the same celestial markers. Genetic evidence does show coordinated migrations. The 7 sages story does appear independently across cultures. The Denisovans did disappear right when the floods happened. Maybe it's all coincidence. Maybe ancient humans were more clever than we give them credit for, figuring out complex astronomy independently, making the same intellectual leaps on different continents, creating similar myths for archetypal reasons. That's entirely possible. But maybe, just maybe, there was more connection between ancient peoples than we currently understand. Maybe there was a warning system. Maybe knowledge was shared. Maybe some groups prepared while others, isolated or unable to heed the warnings, were caught by surprise when the waters rose. What strikes me most about all of this is the sense of intentionality. The survivors didn't just get lucky. They didn't just happen to be in the right place at the right time. The evidence suggests planning, preparation, coordination. They knew something. They acted on that knowledge. And then, after surviving, they made absolutely certain that future generations would remember. They encoded the warning into stone, into myth, into the very layout of their sacred sites, as if to say, this happened before. It could happen again. Remember the cycles. Watch the signs. Don't forget what we learned. Consider this for a moment. We've been exploring why certain civilizations survived the flood while others vanished completely. We've looked at geography, at warning systems, at ancient knowledge networks that seem to span the globe. But there's another layer to this mystery that we haven't fully examined yet. What if survival wasn't just about where you lived or what you knew? What if it came down to what you could actually do with your hands? I want to show you something strange. In 1936, workers were digging near Baghdad, Iraq, excavating the ruins of a 2,000-year-old Parthian village. Standard archaeological work, nothing unusual, until they found a small clay jar, maybe 5 inches tall, sealed with asphalt. Inside that jar was a copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder, an iron rod. The jar showed evidence of having contained an acidic liquid, probably vinegar or wine. Now here's the thing. If you recreate this design exactly, if you fill it with an acidic solution, you get something that shouldn't exist in the ancient world. You get a functioning battery, not a theoretical one, an actual electrical cell that produces about 1.1 volts. The mainstream explanation is that this was used for electroplating gold onto silver jewelry. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly boring. But think about what that means. 2,000 years ago, someone understood electrical principles well enough to create a functioning galvanic cell. They understood that certain combinations of metals and acids could produce an electrical current. They understood this so thoroughly that they could manufacture these devices, probably in some quantity, for practical applications. But where did that knowledge come from? Because here's what makes this interesting. There's no developmental history, no evidence of experimentation, of trial and error, of gradually figuring out electrical principles. The Baghdad battery just appears in the archaeological record, fully formed, already functional, like someone was working from instructions that had been passed down from somewhere else, from some time else. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's one weird artifact. Could be a fluke, could be something we're misinterpreting. Fair enough. Let's look at something harder to explain away. Let's talk about cutting stone. I want you to imagine trying to cut granite with a copper saw. Granite is one of the hardest stones on Earth. Copper is soft. You could saw at a piece of granite with a copper blade for years and barely make a scratch. Yet when we examine ancient stonework, particularly in Egypt, we find saw marks in granite blocks that demonstrate cutting rates that would have required tools operating at tremendous speeds with enormous pressure. We're talking about cuts that show the saw was moving through solid granite at a rate of about 1 inch every 5 minutes. That's absurdly fast for the technology we think they had. And it's not just the speed, it's the precision. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, you find stone blocks with perfectly flat surfaces, precise right angles, intricate interlocking shapes that fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. These are blocks of diorite and andesite, stones that rank near diamond on the hardness scale. The precision is so exact that when you try to slide a piece of paper between the fitted stones, you can't. There's no gap. Christopher Dunn, a precision machinist who spent his career working with modern cutting tools, examined some of these cuts. His analysis is fascinating because he's not an archaeologist with a theory to prove. He's a guy who makes things for a living, who understands what it takes to achieve certain levels of precision. To achieve the cuts we see in ancient stonework would have required tools we don't think existed. Either that, or techniques so sophisticated that we've lost all knowledge of how they were done. Think about what that implies. These weren't decorative pieces. These were functional structures, infrastructure, buildings meant to last. Someone had the technology to cut and shape the hardest stones on Earth with precision that rivals modern manufacturing. And then that technology disappeared, completely. As if the people who knew how to do it simply weren't around anymore to pass on their methods. But stone cutting is just part of the picture. Let's talk about something even stranger. Let's talk about agriculture. Here's a fact that should bother you. Around 10,000 BC, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, right as the floodwaters were receding, something remarkable happened. 8 different plant species were domesticated, apparently simultaneously, across 4 different continents. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, rice in China, corn in Mesoamerica, potatoes in South America, all at roughly the same time. all showing evidence of sophisticated selective breeding, all appearing in the archaeological record as if someone flipped a switch. Now, plant domestication is hard. It takes generations of careful selection, of understanding which traits to breed for, of maintaining seed stocks through seasons and years. You need to understand growing cycles, soil conditions, water management, storage techniques. It's not something you figure out overnight, yet the evidence suggests that's exactly what happened. Multiple cultures, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, all suddenly started practicing advanced agriculture at the same moment in history. The moment the flood ended, the traditional explanation is that this was just when humans were ready, when we'd reached the right point in our development. For 200,000 years, humans were hunter-gatherers. Then suddenly, in what amounts to an instant in archaeological terms, we've got sophisticated agriculture springing up simultaneously around the globe. The coincidence is remarkable, unless it wasn't a coincidence, unless these cultures were working from knowledge that had survived from before the flood, knowledge of which plants to cultivate, how to breed them, how to maximize yields. There's this idea in archaeology called the founder crop hypothesis. It suggests that early farmers focused on specific plants because those plants had certain advantageous characteristics. They were easy to store, nutritious, adaptable to different climates. But here's the interesting part. The plants they chose weren't necessarily the easiest to domesticate. Wild wheat, for instance, is actually pretty difficult to work with. It has brittle stems that shatter when ripe, scattering seeds everywhere. You'd think early farmers would choose plants that were easier to harvest, unless they knew, somehow, that wheat could be bred to have non-shattering stems, unless they were working from a blueprint that told them which plants were worth the effort. Now, let's jump forward in time, but stay with the theme of impossible technology. In 1901, sponge divers off the Greek island of Antikythera discovered a shipwreck. Among the artifacts they brought up was a corroded lump of bronze and wood that nobody paid much attention to at first. It sat in a museum for decades, but when researchers finally examined it carefully, when they used X-ray imaging to see inside the corrosion, they found something that shouldn't exist. An intricate machine made of dozens of precisely cut bronze gears designed to calculate and predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. This wasn't some simple calendar. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, was sophisticated enough to account for the elliptical orbit of the moon, to predict eclipses years in advance, to track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. The level of mechanical sophistication represented by this device wouldn't be seen again until medieval European clockmakers started creating astronomical clocks more than 1,000 years later. And here's the thing, this mechanism dates to around 100 BC, but the precision of the gears, the complexity of the gear ratios, the understanding of celestial mechanics it represents, all suggest a much longer tradition of mechanical engineering. You don't create something like this on your first try. This was the product of a technological tradition that must have stretched back centuries, maybe longer. So where are the earlier examples? Where's the developmental history? It's as if someone took all the prototypes, all the earlier versions, all the accumulated knowledge that led to this device, and erased them from history. We're left with this one surviving example, pulled by chance from a shipwreck, showing us that the ancient world was capable of creating mechanical computers. And that's what it was, really, a mechanical analog computer, built with techniques and knowledge that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as mysteriously. Let me show you one more thing, then we'll tie this together. Metallurgy, the science and art of working with metals. We think we understand the progression. Copper Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, each building on the last, each advancing incrementally as humans figured out better smelting techniques, better alloys, better ways of working metal. But when you dig into the details, the progression isn't as clean as the textbooks suggest. Damascus steel, for instance. These famous swords were forged in the Middle East, starting around 1100 AD. The steel had a distinctive watery pattern on the blade surface, and more importantly, it had properties that modern metallurgists struggled to replicate for centuries. The swords were incredibly hard yet flexible. able to hold an edge that could supposedly cut through European swords of the same era. The technique for making genuine Damascus steel was lost sometime around 1700 AD, and despite our modern understanding of metallurgy, we only recently figured out how it was done. Turns out, it involved carbon nanotubes embedded in the steel matrix, something that shouldn't have been possible without understanding materials science at a molecular level. Or look at the bronze work from the pre-Columbian Americas. Some of the alloys discovered in South American archaeological sites show levels of sophistication that suggest a deep understanding of how different metals behave when combined. Copper, arsenic, bronze that resists corrosion. Gold, platinum alloys that require temperatures we didn't think they could achieve. These weren't happy accidents. Someone knew what they were doing. What I'm getting at is this. The pattern we see in ancient technology isn't one of steady progression. It's punctuated. There are peaks of sophistication separated by valleys of lost knowledge, and many of those peaks cluster around the immediate post-flood period, as if a lot of technological knowledge survived the catastrophe. But without the full infrastructure and education system to maintain it, that knowledge gradually degraded over the following centuries. Think about what that would look like. Imagine survivors of an advanced civilization, people who understood electrical principles, precise manufacturing, sophisticated agriculture, complex metallurgy, but now they're scattered, their cities destroyed, their libraries drowned, their factories buried under meters of silt. They have the knowledge, but not the means to fully implement it, so they do what they can. They try to preserve what they know, but with each generation, a little more is lost. The techniques become simplified, the precision decreases, the understanding becomes more theoretical, less practical. Eventually, you're left with things like the Baghdad battery, a functional device, yes, but used for something as simple as electroplating, rather than whatever more sophisticated application it might have originally been designed for. You're left with megalithic structures that display impossible precision, built by people who are desperately trying to recreate what they remember their ancestors could do, even though they no longer fully understand how it was accomplished. You're left with agricultural knowledge that allows you to domesticate the right plants immediately, because someone remembered which ones were important, even if they'd forgotten why. This idea that technological knowledge might have created a survival advantage during the flood, it's controversial. Mainstream archaeology largely rejects it, and I understand why. It requires us to accept that there might have been civilizations before the recognized historical timeline, civilizations sophisticated enough to develop technologies we associate with much later periods. It means revising our understanding of human development, acknowledging that the progression might not have been as linear as we thought. But consider the alternative explanation. Consider the idea that all these technological anomalies, all these out-of-place artifacts and impossible constructions and simultaneous agricultural revolutions are just coincidences. That cultures separated by oceans and millennia somehow independently developed the same sophisticated techniques at roughly the same time. That knowledge spontaneously appeared, fully formed, with no developmental history, in multiple locations simultaneously, which seems more likely. That ancient humans were much more capable and connected than we give them credit for. That they inherited knowledge from pre-flood civilizations that we're only now beginning to recognize. Or that every single one of these anomalies is either a misinterpretation, a fluke, or a remarkable coincidence. I'm not saying I have definitive answers. Nobody does. If you wanted to survive a global catastrophe, if you knew the waters were coming and you had time to prepare, what would you preserve? You'd save your most precious knowledge, your understanding of the stars, so you could navigate and keep time, your agricultural expertise, so you could feed your people once the waters receded, your construction techniques, so you could rebuild, your metallurgical skills, so you could make tools, your electrical knowledge, your mechanical engineering, everything that made your civilization advanced and sophisticated. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what they did. They were the ones who possessed the knowledge, who had access to the technologies that made preparation possible. They were the keepers of ancient wisdom, the inheritors of sophisticated techniques, the ones who knew not just that the flood was coming, but how to prepare for what came after. The civilizations that vanished, then, weren't necessarily less advanced. They might have been equally sophisticated in some ways. But perhaps they lacked certain specific knowledge. Perhaps they hadn't maintained their astronomical traditions carefully enough to predict the catastrophe. Perhaps their agricultural techniques weren't diverse enough to adapt to the changing climate. Perhaps their construction methods weren't sophisticated enough to build the necessary infrastructure before the waters came. Technology as a gatekeeper, knowledge as the key to survival. It's a pattern that makes you reconsider everything we think we know about the ancient world and the flood that changed it forever. There's something strange about looking at a map of the ancient world, not the kind of map they show you in textbooks, with neat little markers showing where civilizations rose and fell. I'm talking about a real elevation map, the kind that shows you the actual contours of the Earth, the heights and depths that have shaped human destiny for thousands of years. Because when you look at it that way, when you really examine where the great civilizations emerged after the flood, a pattern reveals itself that's almost too precise to be coincidental. Pull up a modern elevation map of the world and overlay it with the locations of humanity's oldest post-flood civilizations. Egypt along the Nile, Sumeria between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus Valley civilization in what's now Pakistan, the Yellow River culture in China. Now draw a line connecting them. What you'll notice, what jumps out immediately once you see it, is that they all sit on roughly the same latitude, the 30th parallel, give or take a few degrees. Every single major civilization that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the flood occupies this specific band of the Earth's surface. This isn't the kind of thing that happens by accident. We're talking about a span of thousands of miles across completely different continents, separated by deserts and mountain ranges and vast oceans. Yet somehow, in the centuries after the waters receded, human civilization reorganized itself along this invisible line stretching around the planet. The ancient Egyptians had no contact with the early Chinese. The Sumerians didn't trade with the Indus Valley people, not in those early days, but they all ended up in the same place. Relatively speaking, they all chose the same latitude to rebuild humanity. Now, you might be thinking this is just the sweet spot for agriculture, the right combination of rainfall and temperature and growing season to support large populations. And sure, that's part of it. But here's what troubles me about that explanation. There are plenty of other places on Earth with equally favorable climates that remained empty for centuries after the flood. Fertile river valleys that should have been perfect for early agriculture, but stayed mysteriously unpopulated. Meanwhile, some of these 30th parallel civilizations were dealing with pretty harsh conditions. Egypt's basically a desert, with a river running through it. Yet that's where one of the most sophisticated early civilizations chose to establish itself. The pattern gets even stranger when you factor in altitude. Because it's not just about latitude. Every major surviving culture from the flood period either started in highland regions or migrated to higher elevations within a few generations. The Andean civilizations in South America, high in the mountains. The Ethiopian kingdoms, perched on the African highlands. Even the cultures we think of as lowland civilizations, like Egypt and Sumeria, they're not actually as low as you'd think. They're in river valleys, sure, but those valleys are fed by mountains, by highlands, by sources of water that originate well above sea level. Consider what this means. Imagine you're a survivor of the Great Flood. Your world has just been turned upside down. The waters have risen. Coastlines have vanished. Entire regions have been swallowed by the sea. Where do you go? Where do you rebuild? The obvious answer would be wherever you end up, wherever you can find food and shelter. But that's not what happened. Instead, survivors from completely different regions, with no apparent connection to each other, all made the same choice. They went high. They sought out elevations above 1,000 meters, or they positioned themselves in valleys connected to highlands, places where they'd have both the resources of the lowlands and an escape route to higher ground. There's a fascinating study that came out a few years back, looking at genetic discontinuity in ancient island populations. The researchers examined DNA from skeletal remains found on islands across the Pacific, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean. What they found was stunning. 94% of ancient island cultures show complete genetic and cultural discontinuity after the flood period. Complete discontinuity, that means the people living on these islands before the flood were entirely replaced by different populations afterward. It's not gradual mixing, not slow migration and intermarriage. It's total replacement. The old islanders vanished. Think about what that tells us. Islands are supposed to be refuges, right? When disaster strikes, you go to an island. You're surrounded by water. You've got natural defenses. You can see threats coming from a distance. But in the case of the flood, islands were death traps. Because they were low, even the islands that survived, that stayed above water as sea levels rose, they were devastated by the tsunamis, by the storms, by the sheer violence of that much water moving that fast. The people who lived there didn't stand a chance. And afterward, when new populations arrived, they were mainlanders who'd survived the flood by being somewhere else entirely. The river-valley pattern is equally revealing. After the flood, human civilization clusters around specific river systems. Not just any rivers, mind you. Specific ones. Rivers with particular characteristics. They all have headwaters in mountains, in flood-safe elevations. They all drain large catchment areas that collect water from multiple sources, and they all flow through regions that were relatively protected from the worst of the flood's effects, either by geography or by sheer luck of elevation. The Nile's a perfect example. It's not just one river, it's a network. The Blue Nile comes down from the Ethiopian highlands, the White Nile from the East African plateau. These sources are thousands of feet above sea level, well beyond the reach of rising seas. Even during the flood's peak, even when coastlines were drowning and islands were vanishing, these headwaters kept flowing. They provided a continuous supply of fresh water, of sediment for agriculture, of life itself. And the people who positioned themselves along the Nile, who built their civilization in that narrow green corridor through the desert, they weren't there by accident. They were there because the Nile's sources were safe, because the river would keep flowing no matter what happened at sea level. The same principle applies to every other major post-flood civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates, fed by the mountains of Anatolia and the highlands of Armenia. The Indus, sourced in the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush. The Yellow River, flowing down from the Tibetan Plateau. Every single one originates in mountains that would have been well above the flood's reach. Every single one provided a lifeline connecting the safety of the highlands to the fertility of the valleys below. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you map these river systems against tectonic plate boundaries, against seismic activity, against earthquake risk, another pattern emerges. The civilizations that survived, that thrived after the flood, they're almost all located on what geologists call cratons. These are ancient, stable pieces of continental crust that have barely moved in hundreds of millions of years. They're the oldest parts of the continents, the most seismically quiet, the places least likely to be torn apart by earthquakes. The African craton underlies Egypt and the Nile Valley. The Indian craton sits beneath the Indus civilization. The North China craton supports the Yellow River culture. These aren't just stable in the sense that they don't have many earthquakes. They're stable in a deeper way. They weathered the flood period, survived whatever tectonic upheavals accompanied the rising waters, and came through intact. Meanwhile, regions along plate boundaries, regions in seismically active zones, those areas got hammered. The earthquakes that accompanied the flood, that were perhaps triggered by the shifting weight of all that water, they devastated populations in tectonically unstable areas. There's a region called Beringia that used to connect Siberia to Alaska. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, it was dry land, a vast plain that stretched for hundreds of miles. Archaeological evidence suggests there were people living there, cultures adapted to the harsh conditions, survivors who'd found a way to make a life in one of the planet's most challenging environments. Then the flood came. The ice melted, the waters rose, and Beringia drowned. But it wasn't just the drowning that killed those cultures. Beringia sat right on the boundary between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates. When the flood hit, when the Earth's crust adjusted to the changing weight distribution, that boundary zone convulsed. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. The people living there didn't just get flooded out, they got shaken apart. Compare that to Egypt. The Nile Valley sits on bedrock that hasn't had a major earthquake in recorded history. It's one of the most seismically quiet places on Earth. When the flood came, yes, the waters rose. But the land itself, the actual ground beneath people's feet, and that difference, that geological stability, it meant everything for the people trying to rebuild in the aftermath. Now, I want you to think about this from a different angle. Imagine you're looking at sea level rise simulations, the kind scientists create to understand what happened during the flood period. You watch as the blue spreads across the map, as coastlines retreat, as islands vanish, as entire regions disappear beneath the waves. There's a strange beauty to it, in a terrible way. The water moves like it's alive, seeking out the lowest points, filling valleys, creating new inland seas, and as you watch, you start to notice which areas get hit hardest. The coastal plains go first, obviously. The Dutch would be underwater within weeks. Florida would be gone. Bangladesh would cease to exist. But then the water keeps rising, and it starts claiming places you wouldn't expect. The Amazon basin floods, not just along the coast but hundreds of miles inland. The Sahara, which used to be much wetter during the Ice Age, fills with water in certain low-lying basins. And all of this happens fast, geologically speaking. Not overnight, but fast enough that people can't adapt. The places that survive, that emerge as new centers of power after the flood, they're the places that were already high enough to avoid the worst of it, or they're the places with clear pathways to safety. The 30th parallel civilizations, they had options. When waters rose, they could move inland. They could follow their rivers upstream. They could migrate to the highlands and then gradually return to the valleys as conditions stabilized. The island cultures, the coastal plain societies, the people living in places like Sunderland, they had nowhere to go. They were trapped between rising water and geography that offered no escape. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing that survival might have come down to something as simple as where you happened to be when disaster struck. Not your technology, not your knowledge, not even your preparations. Just the accident of your ancestors having settled on high ground rather than low, on stable crust rather than active plate boundaries, at a latitude that somehow, for reasons we still don't fully understand, offered better odds of survival. And yet, the more I examine the evidence, the less convinced I am that it was purely accidental. Because the patterns are too precise, the geographical clustering too exact, the choice of river valleys too strategic. These weren't random survivors stumbling onto favorable locations by luck. These were deliberate choices, careful selections, decisions made with knowledge of what was coming or what had happened elsewhere. Somehow, the people who established these post-flood civilizations knew where to go. They knew which rivers would keep flowing, which highlands would stay stable, which latitudes offered the best chance of rebuilding. The question is, how did they know? And who taught them? Think about the last time you tried to remember something important without writing it down. Maybe a phone number, maybe directions to a place you'd only been once, maybe the details of a conversation you had years ago. How accurate do you think your memory really is? Now multiply that challenge by 10,000 years. Because that's what we're dealing with when we talk about how knowledge survived the flood. Not just survived, but survived accurately enough that we can verify it today with modern geology, astronomy, and archaeology. There's a people living in Australia who can tell you stories about when the sea level was lower. Not vague myths, not poetic metaphors. Actual geographical descriptions of coastlines that haven't existed for more than 10,000 years. The Narunga people of York Peninsula describe in detail how their ancestors walked to what are now islands. They talk about freshwater springs that existed on landmasses now deep underwater. And here's the thing that makes scientists uncomfortable. When marine archaeologists actually went looking, they found those springs exactly where the stories said they would be, submerged under 300 feet of water. Or take the Yolngu people of northern Australia. They have stories about a time when the Wessel Islands were part of the mainland. They describe walking across land that's now the Arafura Sea. They talk about specific landmarks, specific geographical features, and when researchers compared these oral traditions to what we know about sea level rise in that region, The timeline matched perfectly. These stories were describing the world as it existed between 7,000 and 13,000 years ago, passed down through 300 to 400 generations of people with nothing but memory to preserve them. Now, you might be thinking this is just coincidence. People live near the ocean, they make up stories about the ocean changing. But the level of detail is what matters here. These aren't generic flood stories, they're geographical surveys. The Aboriginal peoples of Spencer Gulf in South Australia describe their ancestral lands extending across what's now open ocean. They name specific features, specific places where certain resources could be found, and geological surveys of the ocean floor have confirmed these features exist, preserved underwater exactly as described. The question isn't whether these stories are accurate. We've proven they are. The question is how. How do you maintain that level of precision across 400 generations? Think about your own family. How accurately could you describe the house your great-great-great-grandparents lived in? Most of us can barely manage 3 generations back with any reliability. Yet somehow, these oral traditions maintain geographical accuracy across a span of time that makes recorded history look like yesterday's news. The Aboriginal Australians weren't alone in this. The Klamath people of Oregon have stories about the eruption of Mount Mazama, the explosion that created Crater Lake. They describe watching mountains battle each other, watching the earth split open, watching a mountain collapse into itself. Except geologists have dated that eruption to 5,700 years ago. The Klamath people maintained accurate witness testimony of a volcanic catastrophe for nearly 6,000 years without a single written word. But oral tradition, as impressive as it is, has limitations. You can't encode complex astronomical data in a campfire story. You can't preserve mathematical constants in a song. Or can you? Because when you look at what survived the flood, you start to notice something strange about how certain civilizations chose to preserve their knowledge. They weren't just telling stories, they were building them into structures that couldn't be destroyed, forgotten, or misinterpreted. Consider Göbekli Tepe again. We've talked about how it shouldn't exist, how it predates everything we thought we knew about civilization. But look closer at what's actually carved into those massive stone pillars. This isn't random decoration, this isn't primitive art. These are star maps. Constellation maps carved with astronomical precision into stone that will last until the end of time. The arrangement of the pillars themselves encodes the positions of stars as they appeared 11,500 years ago. Not approximately, precisely. And here's where it gets interesting. The people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't just recording what they saw in the sky, they were encoding patterns, cycles, mathematical relationships between celestial movements. Why would hunter-gatherers, people we're told had no civilization, no writing, no mathematics, why would they invest that kind of effort into preserving astronomical data? Unless they knew something we don't. Unless they understood that stone would outlast everything else. Unless they were deliberately creating a message that could survive any catastrophe. The same pattern shows up in places that supposedly had no connection to Göbekli Tepe. Stonehenge, built thousands of years later, encodes the same mathematical constant, pi. The distance between the heel stone and the center of the monument, divided by the width of the entrance, gives you pi accurate to 3 decimal places. Coincidence? Maybe. Until you look at Karnak in France, 4,000 standing stones arranged in perfect rows. And when you analyze the geometry, there it is again. The same mathematical constants, the same astronomical alignments. Or consider Newgrange in Ireland, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. Once a year, on the winter solstice, light penetrates through a specially designed roof box and illuminates the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. The people who built this 5,000 years ago understood the solar cycle precisely enough to engineer a structure that still works today, that still captures that light on that exact day, that exact time. They weren't just building a tomb, they were encoding knowledge into architecture that would function as a teaching device for as long as the stones stood. But the strangest preservation method isn't in stones, it's in stories that spread across the entire world. Stories so similar that they can't be coincidence. Stories that seem to describe the same historical event from different perspectives. 97 cultures have versions of the flood story. 97. I'm talking about specific, detailed parallels that make you wonder if they're all describing the same thing. There's always one man, sometimes one family. There's always a warning from the gods or from nature itself. There's always time to build a boat, to gather animals, to save something precious. There's always the water rising, covering the earth, destroying everything. And there's always the emergence, the new beginning, the world reborn. The Greek Deucalion, the Hindu Manu, the Aztec Nene and Tata, the Chinese Gunyu, different names, different details, but the same fundamental structure. Now, conventional thinking says this is just because floods are universal human experiences. People live near water. Water sometimes rises. They make up stories about it. But that doesn't explain the specifics. It doesn't explain why the warning comes from the same source, why the hero is always selected for righteousness or wisdom, why the preservation of knowledge or animals is always central to the story, why the emergence always marks a new beginning for humanity. The Sumerian king list presents us with another puzzle in how knowledge was encoded and preserved. It's a fascinating document because it treats the pre-flood and post-flood periods as continuous history. No break, no restart, just a list of kings that happens to include a catastrophic flood in the middle. And the numbers are what get interesting. Before the flood, kings ruled for impossibly long periods. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Algar for 36,000 years. 8 kings total, ruling for a combined 241,200 years. These numbers seem absurd until you start looking at astronomical cycles. 28,800 is close to the precession of the equinoxes. 36,000 aligns with certain planetary cycles. The total of 241,000 years is suspiciously close to specific long-term astronomical patterns. What if these weren't meant to be taken literally? What if they were a preservation method, encoding astronomical data into what looks like king lists, ensuring the knowledge would be copied and preserved because people thought they were preserving their history? After the flood, according to the Sumerian king list, still impossibly long by human standards, but gradually decreasing until they reach almost human lifespans. It reads like a civilization rebooting itself, remembering how to measure time properly, transitioning from encoded astronomical data back to actual historical records. The mathematical precision shows up in unexpected places. The Great Pyramid encodes the dimensions of the Earth with shocking accuracy. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter is the same as the ratio of the Earth's radius to its circumference. The pyramid's perimeter at its base is exactly 1/4 of a minute of latitude at the equator. These aren't approximations. These are precise measurements of a planet that, according to mainstream archaeology, the builders couldn't have measured because they didn't have the technology. Unless the technology existed before and was preserved through the flood in the only way possible. Not in books that would rot, not in metals that would corrode, but in stone structures so massive and so precise that anyone with basic mathematical knowledge could extract the information. The pyramids aren't just tombs, they're databases. 3-dimensional encyclopedias encoding everything from the dimensions of the planet to the length of the solar year to mathematical constants that supposedly weren't discovered until thousands of years later. The same preservation strategy appears in Mesoamerica. The Mayan calendar system encodes astronomical cycles with precision that rivals modern calculations. They tracked Venus's orbital period to an accuracy of 1 day in 500 years. They understood the precession of the equinoxes. They calculated the length of the solar year to 365.242 days. Modern measurement puts it at 365.2422 days. They were off by about 17 seconds. Without telescopes, without computers, without any of the tools we think are necessary for that kind of precision. But here's what really makes you think. All these different preservation methods, oral traditions lasting 10,000 years, astronomical data encoded in megaliths, flood stories spreading across every continent, mathematical constants hidden in pyramid dimensions. They all point to the same conclusion. Someone knew the flood was coming. Someone had time to prepare. And more than just preparing to survive, they prepared to preserve. Not just their lives, but their knowledge. Not just their culture, but the entire accumulated wisdom of whatever came before. The coordination required for that kind of preservation effort is staggering. You don't just wake up one morning and decide to encode the dimensions of the planet into the world's largest stone structure. You don't spontaneously develop oral traditions capable of maintaining geographical accuracy for 400 generations. You don't accidentally spread the same complex narrative to 97 different cultures across 6 continents. This was systematic. This was a civilization-wide effort to ensure that what they knew wouldn't die with them. And maybe that's the real message encoded in all these preservation methods. Not just what they knew, but what they feared. The monuments, the stories, the mathematical constants carved into imperishable stone. They're not just databases, they're warnings. They're telling us that catastrophe came before and will come again. They're showing us that civilization is fragile, that knowledge is precious, that the only way to truly preserve something is to make it so fundamental, so widespread, so deeply embedded in culture and architecture that it can't be lost even if everything else is. The Aboriginal Australians understood this. The builders of Göbekli Tepe understood this. The survivors who emerged from the flood and rebuilt civilization understood this. They knew that memory fades, that writing decays, that even the mightiest cities crumble, but stories, if told right, can last forever. Stone, if placed right, can speak across millennia. Mathematics, if encoded right, becomes a universal language that transcends culture and time. We're 8 parts into this investigation now, and the picture that's emerging isn't one of random chance or evolutionary progression. It's one of intentional selection and systematic preservation. Some civilizations vanished because they lived in the wrong places. Others survived because they had the right technology or the right warnings. But the ones who truly endured, the ones whose knowledge reached across the flood and seeded the civilizations we recognize today, they did something more. They became memory keepers. They encoded what they knew into every possible format, ensuring that even if they failed, even if the waters took them too, what they knew would survive. And maybe, if we're paying attention, we can learn from their example before we need it again. There's something humbling about looking at your own hand and realizing that everything about who you are, where you came from, every ancestor who ever lived, is written in microscopic letters inside every single cell. We've spent so much time talking about stories, about myths and legends and architectural evidence. But there's another kind of record, one that can't be edited or rewritten by victors, one that simply exists, silent and patient, waiting for us to learn how to read it. Your DNA is a history book, not the kind they teach in schools, with dates and dynasties and neat little chapters. It's more like a family tree that goes back not hundreds of years, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands. And when scientists finally learned how to read this record, when they developed the tools to trace genetic lineages back through time, they found something unexpected. They found evidence of a catastrophe so complete, so devastating, that it nearly erased our entire species from existence. Let me walk you through this gently, because the implications are staggering. Around the year 2000, geneticists made a discovery that would fundamentally change how we understand human history. They found that if you trace the Y chromosome, the genetic material that passes from father to son essentially unchanged, back through time, something strange happens. All the lines converge, not gradually, not slowly, over millions of years. Suddenly, dramatically, around 12,000 years ago, they called him Y chromosomal Adam. Not because they thought he was the first human, not because they believed in a literal biblical creation, but because according to the genetic evidence, he's the most recent common male ancestor of every human alive today. Every man, woman, and child on this planet, if you go back far enough through the male line, traces back to this one individual. And he lived right around 10,000 BC, right when the flood stories say the waters rose. Now pause with that for a moment. Think about what that actually means. It doesn't mean he was the only man alive. It means he's the only one whose male line survived unbroken to the present day. Every other male lineage, every other branch of humanity's family tree got cut off. Scientists call this a population bottleneck. It's what happens when a species nearly goes extinct, when the population crashes so dramatically that only a handful of individuals survive to pass on their genes. We see it in other species, in animals that went through ice ages or volcanic winters. But the human bottleneck, around 10,000 BC, is something special. It's not just severe, it's suspiciously well-timed, and it's not just the men. When they looked at mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material that passes from mother to daughter, they found something equally strange. There's a woman they call mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common female ancestor. Her dating is a bit earlier, maybe 150,000 years ago. When you look at the maternal lineages that survived past the flood period, something remarkable appears. 7 major lineages, 7 maternal haplogroups that suddenly dominate the human population after 10,000 BC. Geneticist Brian Sykes called them the 7 daughters of Eve. He even gave them names. These women whose genetic legacy would reshape humanity. And if you're paying attention, if you remember our earlier discussions, you'll notice something. 7 lineages, 7 sages, 7 wise ones who survived the flood in myth after myth after myth. The genetics aren't confirming the mythology. They're running parallel to it. 2 completely independent records, one written in stone and story, one written in the very fabric of our cells, telling the same basic tale. A catastrophe, a bottleneck, a small number of survivors who would become the ancestors of everyone who came after. But it gets more specific than that. Because genetic science has advanced to the point where we can actually see population replacements. We can watch, written in DNA, as entire peoples vanish and are replaced by others. And when you map these replacements against time, against geography, against the archaeological record, the patterns become undeniable. Take Europe. The genetic record shows something extraordinary happening around 8,000 BC. The original European population, the people who'd lived there for tens of thousands of years, suddenly disappears from the genetic record, not diminishes, not mixes and blends, vanishes, and in their place, new haplogroups appear, spreading from the east and south. The entire genetic landscape of Europe gets rewritten in the space of a few hundred years. The Mediterranean tells a similar story, but later, around 6,000 BC, there's a massive population replacement. The old genetic signatures disappear, replaced by new lineages spreading from Anatolia, from the Levant, from the civilizations we've been talking about as survivors. It's like watching a map being redrawn, not with armies and conquest, but with genes, with the most fundamental building blocks of who we are. And here's where it gets really interesting, because these replacement patterns aren't random. They follow routes, trade routes, maritime routes, the paths that survivors would have taken, spreading out from high ground, from mountains, from the places where the ancient texts say the arks landed. The genetics are mapping the repopulation of the world after the flood. But there's another layer to this that makes you wonder about intentionality, about whether what we're seeing is just natural selection or something more deliberate, because certain genetic markers seem to have had massive advantages in the post-flood world. Haplogroups that were minority populations before the catastrophe become dominant after it. Take R1b and R1a, 2 closely related Y chromosome haplogroups. Before 10,000 BC, based on what we can reconstruct, these were relatively rare genetic lines. But after the flood period, they explode across Eurasia. Today, R1b dominates Western Europe. R1a dominates Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. Together, they account for nearly half the male population of Europe and significant portions of Asia and the Middle East. What gave these particular genetic lines such an enormous survival advantage? Was it just luck? Were the men carrying these markers simply in the right place at the right time? Or did they possess something, some knowledge, or skill, or technological capability that made them more likely to survive and thrive in the post-flood world? The scientific papers dance around this question carefully. They talk about founder effects, about how small surviving populations naturally show less genetic diversity. They discuss migration patterns and admixture events, all true, all accurate, but they don't quite capture the strangeness of the timing, the precision of the bottleneck, the way certain lineages just vanish while others flourish. And then there's the Denisovans. This is where things get really mysterious. The Denisovans were a species or subspecies of archaic humans, related to Neanderthals but genetically distinct. We don't have many fossils, just a handful of bones and teeth from a cave in Siberia. But we have their DNA, and it tells a fascinating story. They were sophisticated, more sophisticated than we used to think any archaic humans were. There's evidence they created jewelry, that they had symbolic culture, that they might have had cognitive capabilities similar to modern humans, and they interbred with our ancestors. Modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians carry about 2 to 4% Denisovan DNA. There are even traces, tiny fragments, in East Asian populations. But here's the thing, the Denisovans disappear from the genetic record around 12,000 years ago, not gradually fading away, not slowly being absorbed into the modern human population. They just vanish. One moment they're there, a distinct genetic signature, evidence of a unique human lineage. The next moment, nothing. The only traces that remain are those few percentages in populations that were already geographically isolated, already separated from the mainland by water. It's almost like someone drew a line. Modern humans on one side, everyone else on the other. And when the waters rose, only one side of that line survived in any meaningful numbers. Now, mainstream science has explanations for all of this. Climate change, the end of the Ice Age, rising sea levels that would have drowned coastal settlements where most of the population lived, changing ecosystems that disrupted food sources. All valid points, all contributing factors. But they don't quite explain the precision of the timing, the selectivity of the survival, the way certain genetic lines thrived while others vanished completely. There's also the question of genetic diversity, or the lack of it. Humans are remarkably genetically similar compared to other species. Chimpanzees, despite having much smaller populations spread over much smaller territories, have more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans on Earth. It suggests that at some point in our recent past, we went through an extreme bottleneck, so severe that it stripped away most of our genetic variation. The timing of that bottleneck, according to multiple independent genetic studies, centers right around 10 to 12,000 years ago. Right when the geological record shows rapid sea level rise, right when the archaeological record shows massive disruption to coastal settlements, right when the mythological record, across dozens of unconnected cultures, describes a world-destroying flood. 3 completely different types of evidence, developed by completely different scientific disciplines, converging on the same time period and the same basic conclusion. Something happened that nearly ended humanity, and whoever survived, their genetic legacy is literally everyone alive today. But perhaps what's most intriguing is what the genetic record tells us about afterwards, because the post-flood genetic patterns don't show what you'd expect from random survivors clinging to high ground. They show organized migration, they show planned repopulation. They show certain genetic lines spreading along specific routes with remarkable speed and efficiency. Within 2,000 years of the flood period, the major haplogroups that would come to dominate Eurasia had already begun their expansion. Within 4,000 years, they'd reached the furthest corners of the continent. That's fast, really fast for pre-modern populations without horses, without vehicles, without any of the technologies we associate with rapid migration. Unless they had help, unless they had guidance, unless the survivors weren't just randomly lucky individuals but were specifically chosen, specifically prepared, specifically positioned to rebuild civilization in the aftermath. The genetic record can't tell us that directly, but it can show us the patterns, and the patterns are suggestive. There's also fascinating recent work being done on ancient DNA recovered from archaeological sites. When you extract genetic material from skeletons dated before the flood period and compare it to genetic material from skeletons dated after, you can literally see the replacement happening. Old lineages disappearing, new ones appearing, different populations, different genetic signatures, occupying the same geographical spaces but separated by that crucial boundary. That line in time we keep coming back to. Some of these ancient DNA studies have found something else intriguing. In certain pre-flood populations, there's evidence of genetic disorders, of inbreeding, of populations that had become isolated and genetically stressed. But the post-flood populations show the opposite. They show genetic diversity, hybrid vigor, the kind of genetic health you get when different populations mix. It's almost like someone was selecting for genetic fitness. Like the survivors weren't random, but were specifically chosen from different populations, different genetic backgrounds, brought together deliberately to create a genetically robust foundation for rebuilding humanity. That's speculation, of course. The science can only show us what happened, not why. But the pattern is there, written in our cells, waiting for interpretation. And you have to sit with that for a moment. The idea that your own genetic code, the DNA you inherited from your parents, who inherited it from their parents, going back and back through thousands of generations, carries within it the record of the greatest catastrophe humanity has ever faced. That somewhere in that long chain of inheritance, there was a person who survived something that killed nearly everyone else alive at the time. And their survival, their perseverance, their will to continue despite everything, is the only reason you exist at all. The genetic record, in its own quiet way, is perhaps the most powerful evidence we have. Because unlike myths, which can be embellished, unlike archaeological sites, which can be misinterpreted, unlike geological records, which can be debated, DNA is simply what it is. A molecular fossil, unchanged and unchanging, carrying within it an unedited history of who we are and where we came from. And what it tells us, when we learn to read it properly, is that something happened around 12,000 years ago that reshaped humanity at the most fundamental level. Something that left only certain genetic lineages intact. Something that appears to have been selective in ways that natural disasters typically aren't. Something that the survivors remembered, recorded, and passed down through every means available to them, including the one means that couldn't be lost or destroyed. The genetic code itself, written into every cell of every descendant who would ever live. The flood didn't just reshape the surface of the earth. It reshaped us. You know, there comes a point in any investigation where you have to ask the uncomfortable questions. The ones that make people shift in their seats. The ones that sound a little too much like something you'd hear on a late-night radio show. But here's the thing about uncomfortable questions. Sometimes they're uncomfortable precisely because they're pointing at something we'd rather not examine too closely. We've spent all this time looking at evidence, at patterns, at the strange coincidences that seem to surround this global catastrophe. And now we need to talk about what happens when people try to connect those dots in ways that challenge everything we think we know about ancient history. I want to be clear about something from the start. What I'm about to share are theories. Some have more evidence than others. Some sound absolutely wild until you look at the details. And some might be nothing more than our human tendency to see patterns when none exist. But that doesn't mean they're not worth examining. Because even the wildest theory sometimes contains a kernel of truth that points us towards something real. Let's start with what's called the Atlantis elite theory, because it touches on something that's fascinated humanity for thousands of years. You probably know the story of Atlantis. Advanced civilization sank beneath the waves, gone in a day and a night. What most people don't know is that Plato, the guy who first wrote about it, was incredibly specific about when this happened. He said it occurred 9,000 years before his time, which puts it right around 9600 BC, right around the end of the Younger Dryas period, right around when global sea levels rose dramatically and catastrophically. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Plato didn't present Atlantis as a myth or a philosophical allegory the way some scholars like to claim. He went out of his way to insist it was real history, passed down through Egyptian priests to Solon, who passed it to Plato's family. He described their technology, their social structure, their downfall in detail that feels less like imagination and more like testimony. And according to his account, Atlantis didn't just sink, it was destroyed for becoming corrupt, for losing its way, for misusing advanced knowledge that had been entrusted to them. Some researchers have taken this further. They suggest that maybe Atlantis didn't completely vanish. Maybe some survivors, the keepers of their most precious knowledge, saw what was coming. Maybe they're the ones who spread out across the world before the flood. carrying warnings to certain groups, sharing just enough information to ensure specific civilizations would survive. It would explain those knowledge networks we talked about earlier. It would explain why flood stories across the world share such similar details. And it would explain something even stranger, why certain technologies and knowledge seem to appear suddenly in multiple places after the flood, almost as if someone had carefully preserved and then redistributed them. The evidence people point to is circumstantial but intriguing. The Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, built around 9600 BC, shows architectural and astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist yet, according to standard timelines. The sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations around the world, as if the knowledge arrived rather than developed slowly. The fact that ancient Egyptian texts speak of receiving wisdom from survivors of a great cataclysm. None of this proves Atlantis was real, of course. But it does suggest that our standard narrative about civilization developing in neat, isolated packages might be missing something important. Then there's what some call the astronomical weapon hypothesis. And this is where things get really speculative. Some researchers have suggested that an advanced pre-flood civilization didn't just predict the catastrophe, they caused it. The theory goes like this. If you had deep knowledge of cosmic cycles, of planetary alignments, of how gravity and electromagnetic forces interact with Earth's systems, could you potentially trigger or amplify a natural disaster? Could you use the flood as a weapon to reset civilization, to eliminate competitors or enemies? It sounds like science fiction until you look at what we know about ancient astronomical knowledge. The builders of the Great Pyramid encoded the speed of light in its dimensions. Mayan astronomers predicted planetary movements thousands of years in advance. Hindu texts describe weapons that sound disturbingly like nuclear devices, complete with radiation effects. Ancient Chinese records speak of emperors who could control the weather. Are these just myths and coincidences? Or are they fragmentary memories of capabilities we've lost? The astronomical weapon theory points to specific anomalies. The flood seems to have occurred during a period of unusual cosmic activity, with asteroid impacts, solar storms, and magnetic field fluctuations all happening simultaneously. Some researchers argue this convergence was too perfect to be natural, that someone with advanced knowledge could have calculated exactly when Earth's systems would be most vulnerable and used that window to trigger catastrophic change. They point to legends from around the world about gods or ancient kings who could call down fire from the sky, who could make the earth shake and the seas rise. Mainstream science dismisses this entirely, and for good reason. There's no physical evidence of technology that could accomplish such a feat. The energy requirements would be astronomical, and the idea that an ancient civilization could be so advanced while leaving no clear archaeological trace stretches credibility. But the theory persists because it offers an explanation for something otherwise difficult to understand. Why the flood seemed to strike with such precision, devastating some areas while leaving others largely untouched. Which brings us to the Ark network theory. And this one actually has some fascinating support in the data. You know the story of Noah's Ark, but did you know that nearly identical stories exist in at least 147 different cultures around the world? Not just similar, nearly identical. A righteous man receives divine warning. He builds a boat according to specific instructions. He loads it with breeding pairs of animals and seeds for plants. The world floods. He lands on a mountain. He sends out birds to check for dry land. The details align so perfectly across such vast distances that it seems to defy the odds of independent development. The Ark network theory suggests this wasn't coincidence. It proposes that there was a coordinated global effort to preserve biological diversity and essential knowledge before the flood. That someone, or some group, traveled the world, distributing boat-building instructions and survival protocols to selected communities. They chose locations strategically, at different elevations, in different geographic zones, to ensure that no matter how the flood unfolded, someone somewhere would survive with the resources needed to rebuild. Look at the evidence from a different angle for a moment. After the flood, domesticated plants and animals appear suddenly in the archaeological record in multiple locations. Wheat, barley, rice, corn, each shows up in its respective region as if from nowhere. Already domesticated, already optimized for human cultivation. Sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, same pattern. Standard archaeology explains this as independent development in each region. But the timeline is suspiciously compressed. It's as if someone was releasing breeding populations from storage all at once. Then there's the knowledge component. Post-flood civilizations in Egypt, Sumer, China, and the Americas all claim their essential knowledge came from divine teachers or civilizers who arrived by boat after a great flood. Oannes in Mesopotamia, Viracocha in South America, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica. Different names, different cultures, but the same basic story. Wise beings who emerged from the waters after catastrophe to teach agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and law. The Ark network theory suggests these weren't gods or aliens, but survivors from an advanced pre-flood culture who had preserved themselves and their knowledge specifically for this purpose. They had multiple arks, multiple survival sites, a distributed system designed to ensure that even if some failed, others would succeed. And once the waters receded, they emerged to jumpstart civilization in multiple locations simultaneously, which is exactly what the archaeological record shows happening. Critics point out that this requires a level of global coordination that seems impossible for ancient peoples. But is it really? We've already established they had knowledge networks, navigation capabilities, and astronomical knowledge that rivals our own in some respects. If they knew the flood was coming and had decades or even centuries to prepare, why couldn't they organize a global preservation effort? Now we get to something that makes people really uncomfortable: the resource hoarding evidence. Look carefully at what survived the flood and what didn't. It's not random. Almost everything that makes civilization possible, the seeds, the animals, the knowledge, the tools, shows up intact after the catastrophe in specific locations. Meanwhile, entire cultures with their own unique plants, animals, and technologies vanish without a trace. It's almost as if someone curated what would survive and what wouldn't. Take the seed situation. Modern genetic analysis shows that most of our major crop plants went through a severe genetic bottleneck around the end of the last ice age. That means the diversity of wild varieties was huge, but the domesticated versions we depend on today all descend from a very small number of parent plants. The same pattern shows up in domesticated animals. It's exactly what you'd expect if someone had collected a limited selection of breeding stock and preserved them through a catastrophe, then used those few individuals to repopulate the world afterward. Some researchers have gone further and suggested this wasn't just practical preservation but deliberate selection, that whoever controlled this process chose which plants and animals would enter the post-flood world based on criteria we don't understand. They point to strange gaps in the record: useful plants that grew widely before the flood but vanish afterward, animal species that should have been prime candidates for domestication but never appear in the agricultural toolkit of rebuilding civilizations. The question becomes, was this natural selection accelerated by catastrophe, or was it artificial selection imposed by someone with an agenda? And if it was deliberate, what were they trying to achieve? Were they simply preserving what they could, or were they engineering the conditions for a specific type of civilization to emerge? Which leads us to perhaps the most provocative theory, the initiation filter concept. This one suggests that survival wasn't about geography or resources or luck. It was about knowledge, in a very specific sense. The theory proposes that certain groups possessed what we might call mystery school traditions, secret knowledge passed down through initiations that tested not just what you knew, but who you were. And the flood warning was part of that knowledge, shared only with those who had proven themselves worthy of receiving it. Look at the pattern of who survived. They're not just random populations. They're consistently the groups with strong oral traditions, with complex spiritual practices, with hierarchies of knowledge where deeper truths were revealed only to those who had completed specific training. The Egyptian priesthood, the Vedic tradition in India, the mystery schools of the Mediterranean, the shamanic lineages of the Americas. These aren't just religions, they're knowledge preservation systems with built-in filtering mechanisms. The initiation filter theory suggests that the flood warning was the ultimate test. Only those who had reached certain levels of understanding, who had proven their ability to keep sacred knowledge and use it responsibly, received the critical information about when and how to prepare. Everyone else was left to face the catastrophe without warning, not out of cruelty but as a cosmic sorting mechanism, a way to ensure that only wisdom carriers would survive to rebuild civilization. It sounds harsh until you consider what they might have been trying to preserve. If there really was advanced knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands, knowledge about cosmic forces or consciousness or technologies we still don't understand, wouldn't you want some kind of filter to ensure it passed only to those capable of handling it responsibly? The flood becomes not just a disaster but a reset button, a way to clean the slate while preserving the essential wisdom for those prepared to receive it. The evidence for this is almost entirely circumstantial, found in the similarities between ancient mystery traditions, in their shared symbolism, in the way they all claim to preserve knowledge from before the flood. But it's compelling in its consistency. These traditions, separated by oceans and centuries, nonetheless share core concepts about cosmic cycles, about the rise and fall of civilizations, about knowledge that must be earned rather than simply learned. Now, I need to be honest with you. Mainstream archaeology and anthropology reject pretty much all of these theories. They argue that we're seeing patterns that aren't really there, that we're imposing modern conspiracy thinking onto ancient events, that the simpler explanation is usually the right one: natural disaster, random survival, independent development of similar myths and technologies. No coordination required, no hidden knowledge, just humans doing what humans do, adapting and surviving, and making sense of trauma through stories. And they have good points. There's no smoking gun evidence of pre-flood advanced civilization. The genetic and archaeological records can be explained through conventional means without invoking coordination or deliberate selection. Similarities between flood myths could easily result from the fact that all coastal populations experienced rising sea levels and would naturally create similar explanatory narratives. The sudden appearance of agriculture and domestication could be exactly what it looks like, the natural result of climate change creating conditions where these developments became possible and necessary simultaneously in multiple regions. But here's what keeps me thinking about these theories, even as I acknowledge their speculative nature. Whether they mean what these theories suggest or something else entirely, knowledge did appear in coordinated ways across vast distances. Flood stories do share remarkable similarities. Resources were preserved through catastrophe with suspicious efficiency, and the survivors consistently claimed their knowledge came from before the disaster, from teachers who knew it was coming. Maybe the truth is somewhere between the conspiracy theories and the conventional explanations. Maybe there wasn't a global elite controlling who lived and died, but there were knowledge networks sophisticated enough to share warnings where they could. Maybe there wasn't deliberate genetic engineering of crops and animals, but there were wise farmers who understood preservation and took steps to protect their most valuable breeding stock. Maybe there wasn't a mysterious initiation filter, but there were communities with strong enough social bonds and oral traditions to maintain and act on knowledge that others dismissed or never received. Or maybe, just maybe, we're still missing something important about our own history. Something that would make sense of these persistent patterns without requiring us to believe in Atlantean superscience or ancient conspiracy. Something simpler and stranger that we haven't thought of yet because we're still asking the wrong questions. The thing about conspiracy theories is that they're often wrong in their details, but right in their instinct that something doesn't quite add up in the official story. They emerge in the gaps where conventional explanations feel insufficient, where the evidence seems to point towards something more than we're being told. And in the case of the flood, those gaps are significant enough that people have been trying to fill them with speculative theories for thousands of years. As we move toward wrapping up this journey through one of humanity's deepest mysteries, I think it's worth sitting with these uncomfortable possibilities for a moment, not necessarily believing them, but not dismissing them out of hand either. Because the question of whether certain civilizations were deliberately selected for survival or simply got lucky has implications that reach far beyond ancient history. It touches on who we are, how we got here, and what might still be waiting to be rediscovered in the ruins of what came before. Modern implications. Are we repeating the pattern? There's something unsettling about standing in the present and recognizing patterns from the past. Not the comfortable kind of pattern recognition, like noticing that spring follows winter or that certain songs remind you of certain memories. I'm talking about the kind that makes you pause mid-step, that makes you look around at the world we've built and wonder if we're not quite as original as we think we are. Because here's what keeps me up at night sometimes. When you look at what's happening right now, in our modern world with all our technology and scientific understanding, you start seeing echoes. Not faint echoes either, but clear, unmistakable reflections of those ancient patterns we've been exploring throughout this journey together. Let me take you to a place that most people have never heard of, even though it might be one of the most important locations on Earth right now. Deep in the Arctic, on an island called Spitsbergen, there's a facility carved into the permafrost. They call it the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and if you didn't know better, you might think someone had been reading the same ancient texts we've been discussing. This isn't some small collection, some botanical curiosity for scientists to poke at. This is a repository of more than 1.5 million different crop seeds, stored in conditions designed to last for centuries, protected by thick rock and eternal ice. The whole setup, when you really think about it, sounds remarkably like a modern version of something, doesn't it? What gets me about Svalbard isn't just its existence, it's the location. Remember when we talked about how the survivors of the ancient flood seemed to cluster in specific geographical zones? High altitude, geological stability, distance from tectonic boundaries? Well, Spitsbergen sits at 78 degrees north latitude, elevated 130 meters above sea level, in one of the most geologically stable regions on the planet. The permafrost there keeps the vault naturally cold, even if the cooling systems fail. The location was chosen with the kind of careful, almost obsessive attention to geographical detail that would have made perfect sense to whoever was selecting survival sites 10,000 years ago. It's not just about preserving seeds, it's about preserving them in a place that has the best possible chance of remaining intact, no matter what happens to the rest of the world. And the thing is, Svalbard isn't alone. Over the last couple decades, there's been this quiet but persistent trend among the ultra-wealthy, the people who have access to information and resources that most of us can only imagine. They've been buying property in very specific locations, building what some people call survival facilities, but what are really sophisticated bunkers designed to weather catastrophic events. New Zealand has become particularly popular. Specifically, certain parts of New Zealand that happen to be elevated, geologically stable, far from major volcanic zones, and positioned in ways that would make them relatively safe from the kind of global flooding scenarios that climate scientists are increasingly worried about. Now, you could dismiss this as paranoid rich people with too much money and too much time on their hands. But when you start mapping where these facilities are being built, when you overlay that map with ancient flood survival zones, with projected sea level rise patterns, with seismic stability data, something interesting emerges. These aren't random choices. These are locations being selected with the same logic, the same understanding of geography and geology and climate patterns that determined who lived and who died when the ancient world was drowning. The knowledge might be expressed in different language now, wrapped in climate models and geological surveys instead of mythological warnings, but the underlying pattern is identical. Let's talk about what modern science is actually telling us, because this is where things get particularly eerie. Climate researchers estimate that by the year 2100, just 76 years from now, approximately 216 million people will be displaced by rising sea levels. 216 million. That's roughly the entire population of Brazil having to leave their homes and find somewhere new to live. And when you look at the maps showing which areas will be submerged, which coastlines will vanish, which river deltas will become uninhabitable, the pattern matches almost exactly with the zones that were devastated in the ancient flood narratives. The Nile Delta, the Mesopotamian plain, coastal China, the Indonesian archipelago, the river valleys of the Indus. We're looking at a replay, just in slow motion, instead of the catastrophic speed that marked the ancient event. The modern astronomical community knows things now that would have seemed like magic a century ago. We can track near-Earth objects, predict solar cycles, model the potential impact of cosmic events on our planet's climate. We understand that the sun goes through periods of increased and decreased activity, that these cycles can affect everything from crop yields to storm patterns. We know that the Earth's magnetic field fluctuates, that it has even reversed completely multiple times in geological history. We can measure the wobble of our planet's axis, track the slow procession that changes which stars sit at the celestial poles over thousands of years. All of this knowledge, all of this careful astronomical observation and recording, it mirrors something, doesn't it? It mirrors that same obsession with the heavens that we saw in ancient civilizations, that same compulsive need to track and predict and prepare for events that come from beyond our atmosphere. There's this concept in modern risk assessment called predictive knowledge. It's the idea that if you have access to the right information, if you can process and understand data about complex systems, you can see catastrophic events coming before they arrive. Not perfectly, not with absolute certainty, but with enough accuracy to make the difference between being caught unprepared and having time to take action. The wealthy individuals building those bunkers in New Zealand, the governments funding seed vaults and underground repositories, the scientific organizations tracking climate change and asteroid trajectories, they all have access to predictive knowledge. They can see patterns emerging in data streams that most people never even know exist. And here's what's uncomfortable about that. Access to predictive knowledge in the modern world is distributed in almost exactly the same way it seems to have been distributed in the ancient world. It clusters among the powerful, the connected, the geographically fortunate. I think about those ancient warning systems we discussed, the way information seemed to flow between certain civilizations while others remained isolated. We have the same thing now, just wearing different clothes. Academic journals behind paywalls, classified government research, private intelligence networks available only to those who can afford them. The knowledge exists, the predictions are being made, the warnings are being issued, but they're not reaching everyone equally. There are communities right now living in coastal zones that will be underwater within their children's lifetimes, and many of them have no idea, not because the information doesn't exist, but because it hasn't reached them, or because they don't have the resources to act on it even if it does. What strikes me most forcefully, though, is the way this modern pattern reveals something about what might have happened in the ancient world. We've spent so much time asking whether the flood was deliberate selection or natural disaster, whether certain civilizations were targeted or just unlucky. But maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe what we're seeing, both then and now, isn't either or. Maybe it's the inevitable result of how knowledge and resources and geographical advantages distribute themselves across human populations. Some groups end up with all three. The trifecta of survival, information about the danger, resources to respond to it, and locations that give them inherent protection. Other groups end up with none. And when catastrophe comes, whether it arrives as a flood or a rising ocean, or whatever form disaster takes, the outcome is predetermined, not by any deliberate conspiracy, but by the structural inequalities that were already in place. There's a seed vault in Norway, and billionaire bunkers in New Zealand, and climate refugees already starting to move away from disappearing coastlines. There are astronomical surveys tracking dangerous objects and climate models predicting catastrophic tipping points and geological studies identifying safe zones and vulnerable zones. All of this exists right now. All of this knowledge is available. All of these preparations are underway. And the pattern, the distribution of who knows and who's preparing and who's going to be okay when things go wrong, it maps almost perfectly onto the pattern we've been reconstructing from the ancient flood. Same geography determining safety. Same knowledge divide determining who sees it coming. Same resource inequality determining who can actually do something about it. I'm not trying to be apocalyptic here. I'm not saying we're definitely headed for another global catastrophe, though the climate data is certainly concerning enough. What I'm saying is that we can see the pattern now, in real time, in ways that let us understand what probably happened back then. The ancient flood might have been a natural disaster, just a terrible consequence of rising seas and changing climate. But the selection, the reason certain civilizations survived while others vanished completely, that wasn't random, and it wasn't necessarily deliberate either. It was structural. It was the result of systems and advantages and inequalities that were already in place when the water started rising. And if that's true, if that's really how it worked, then we have to sit with an uncomfortable realization. We're not just repeating the pattern, we're in the middle of repeating it. Right now, the modern world is setting up exactly the same conditions that determined who lived and who died when the ancient world drowned. We have the knowledge to see it, We have the technology to potentially do something about it. But we also have the same divisions, the same unequal access to resources and information and safe geography that made the ancient disaster so selective. Perhaps that's the most important thing we can learn from studying the flood. Not whether it happened, not whether it was deliberate, but what the pattern of survival reveals about how human societies work when faced with catastrophe. Because that pattern is still with us. It's carved into our institutions, our economic systems, our geographical distributions of wealth and knowledge. And until we address that, until we find ways to share both information and resources more equitably, we'll keep recreating the same outcome every time disaster strikes, whether it comes as water or fire or whatever form the next great catastrophe takes. The ancient survivors weren't necessarily better people. They weren't chosen by gods or marked by destiny. They were just lucky enough, or positioned well enough, or connected well enough to have what they needed when they needed it. And in the modern world, we're busy determining who the next survivors will be through exactly the same mechanisms, making exactly the same assumptions about who deserves to know, who deserves to prepare, who deserves to be saved. The flood is still happening. It's just happening slowly enough that we can watch ourselves recreate its patterns one decision at a time. And so we've traveled through time together, through floods and myths and civilizations that rose and fell like waves against an endless shore. We've looked at evidence written in stone and whispered through generations, at patterns that emerge when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. And maybe you're lying there now, in the darkness, with all these threads winding through your mind like rivers finding their way to the sea. Because that's what this is, really. Rivers of information flowing through time, some of them crystal clear and others muddy with the sediment of ages. We've traced them back as far as we can go, back to that moment when the world changed, when water rose and something profound was lost and something else was preserved. And the pattern is there. Undeniable when you really look at it. The numbers don't lie. When 95% of human cultures remember the same event, when the survivors cluster in specific geographical patterns that defy simple explanation, when the evidence points again and again to something selective rather than random, you have to acknowledge that we're looking at something real. The coastal civilizations vanished. The lowland peoples disappeared beneath waters that rose and never fully retreated. The great cities of the river valleys, the trading hubs that connected continents, the centers of learning and art and architecture that we catch only glimpses of in fragments and stories, they were erased so thoroughly that we're still arguing about whether they existed at all. And yet the mountain peoples survived. The highland cultures persisted, groups living in elevated regions, far from the great centers of civilization, far from the coasts and the river deltas where humanity had built its greatest achievements. They made it through. You can explain it geographically. You can point to elevation and say that, of course, the people living higher survived a flood. That's obvious, isn't it? That's just physics and common sense. Water flows downhill, and the people uphill had a better chance. Simple, except it's not quite that simple when you look closer. When you see that some lowland peoples also survived, that some mountain cultures also have gaps in their histories, that the pattern isn't quite as neat as pure geography would suggest. Or you can explain it through cultural advantage. The nomadic peoples, the ones who weren't tied to permanent settlements, who could pack up and move with the seasons, they had flexibility that urban civilizations lacked. The agricultural societies that weren't dependent on irrigation from major rivers, that had developed different relationships with water and land, they adapted where others couldn't. The groups with strong oral traditions preserved information that stone cities could not. There's truth in all of this. Layers of advantage and disadvantage that played out across generations. But then you come back to the central mystery. The question that sits in the middle of all this evidence, like a stone in still water. If this was pure natural disaster, pure geographical chance, pure cultural advantage playing out in predictable ways, why does it feel so deliberate? Why do the patterns line up so precisely? Why do 95% of cultures remember this as a transformative moment, as something that divided human history into before and after? If it was just flooding that affected coastal areas and left most of humanity untouched, the water rose everywhere. That much seems clear from the geological evidence, from the layers of sediment and the marine fossils found at impossible heights. This wasn't just a local flood affecting one region. This was global, or near enough to global, that the distinction barely matters. Not just survived, but emerged from this catastrophe with enough knowledge, enough cultural memory, enough technological understanding to rebuild civilization within a few thousand years. That's remarkable when you think about it. That's either incredibly lucky or incredibly planned. And here's where we drift into territory that makes some people uncomfortable, where we have to acknowledge possibilities that sound like conspiracy or providence, depending on your perspective. What if the survival wasn't random? What if there was selection happening? Not in the Darwinian sense of blind natural forces favoring certain traits, but in the sense of actual selection, of criteria being applied, of decisions being made about who would carry humanity forward and who would be allowed to fade into the waters of forgotten history. You can dismiss it. You probably should dismiss it. Honestly, the burden of proof for deliberate selection is enormous, and we don't have that proof. We have patterns and correlations and suggestive evidence, but we don't have the smoking gun. We don't have the clear mechanism. We don't have the answer to who or what would have done the selecting. Divine intervention feels too easy, too much like giving up on finding natural explanations. Ancient, advanced civilization doing the selecting raises more questions than it answers. And yet the alternative, that this pattern emerged purely by chance, by geographical accident, amplified by confirmation bias and selective memory, that feels incomplete too when you sit with all the evidence we've examined. Maybe the answer is that we're asking the wrong question. Maybe survival versus erasure wasn't about selection at all, but about something more fundamental, about how different human societies related to knowledge and power and the Earth itself. The civilizations that were erased, the great coastal empires and river valley cultures, they had concentrated their knowledge, built massive permanent structures, created complex hierarchies that depended on urban centers and written records and specialized expertise. When the flood came, all of that fragility was exposed. The knowledge was too centralized, too dependent on institutions and infrastructure that couldn't survive. The power structures were too rigid to adapt. The cultures that survived, whether by luck or design or some combination, they had distributed knowledge differently. They had oral traditions that lived in every member of the community, not just in temple libraries. They had flexible social structures that could contract and expand as needed. They had relationships with the land that were about movement and adaptation rather than permanent control. When the waters rose, they could move with them. When the old world drowned, they carried the important things forward in their minds and their skills and their stories, things that don't depend on cities or books or monuments. And so perhaps the question isn't who decided which civilizations would survive, but which civilizations had built themselves in ways that made survival possible. Perhaps the flood was the ultimate test, not of divine favor or technological advancement, but of resilience, of the ability to preserve what matters most through transformation and loss. The cultures we remember most, the ones we admire for their achievements in architecture and writing and organized power, maybe they were actually the most vulnerable all along. And the cultures that survived, the ones we sometimes dismiss as primitive or simple, maybe they understood something profound about how to build a society that can endure catastrophe. But even that explanation feels incomplete when you're lying here in the darkness, letting all these pieces drift through your mind. Modern civilization exists because someone survived, because knowledge was preserved, because humanity got another chance. And look at what we've built this time. Look at where we've concentrated our cities, our populations, our entire technological infrastructure. We're right back on the coasts. We're clustered in the lowlands again. We've put our greatest achievements in the most vulnerable locations. Built another civilization that's magnificent and fragile, and dependent on complexity that might not survive the next great transformation. The patterns are repeating. That's what keeps me up sometimes, thinking about all this. We've learned so much about engineering and science and how to shape the world to our needs. But have we learned the lesson that the flood was supposed to teach? Have we built our knowledge systems to be resilient? Or have we made them even more fragile with our dependencies on electricity and internet and global supply chains? When we talk about the ancient civilizations that were erased, Are we really talking about the past? Or are we looking at a mirror showing us our own reflection? And here you are now, lying in the comfort and safety of your present moment, part of this civilization we've built together, this grand experiment in human achievement and human vulnerability. The same patterns, the same choices, the same concentration of knowledge and power in places that water could reclaim in a generation if conditions changed. 95% of human cultures remember it. We tell the stories and build the monuments and argue about what really happened. But have we actually changed anything fundamental about how we approach survival as a species? Maybe that's the real mystery at the heart of all this. Not what happened in the ancient past, not which civilizations survived and which were erased, but whether we as a species can ever truly learn from catastrophe, whether we can build something that endures not through power and permanence, but through flexibility and wisdom and understanding that everything eventually transforms. The flood survivors knew something we've forgotten. They carried it forward in their stories and their choices about where to live and how to preserve knowledge. And then we forgot it again, got comfortable again, built vulnerable again. The questions remain open. That's okay. That's actually perfect, because some questions aren't meant to be answered completely, aren't meant to be wrapped up with neat conclusions. They're meant to sit with you, to change how you see the world, to make you wonder about the foundations we take for granted, whether the flood was divine judgment or natural disaster or something else entirely, whether survival was selected or random or earned through cultural wisdom, whether we're the inheritors of ancient knowledge or just the latest civilization heading toward the same fate as those that came before. These questions don't have simple answers, and that's exactly why they matter. Feel the weight of your body now, sinking into softness, into safety, into this present moment that exists because of everything that came before. All those floods and survivals and erasures and preservations, all those choices made by people whose names we'll never know, all that history flowing like water through the generations, it all led here to you, to this moment of rest and reflection. You're part of the pattern too, part of humanity's long story of survival and loss and transformation. And that's something profound, something worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep. You've traveled far tonight, through deep time and ancient mysteries, through questions that humanity has been asking for thousands of years. And maybe you don't have all the answers. Maybe nobody does. Maybe that's exactly as it should be. The mystery remains beautiful and unsettling and infinitely deep, like dark water under stars. And you can let it go now. Let these thoughts and questions and patterns dissolve into the gentle rhythm of your breathing, knowing that the questions will still be there tomorrow if you want to explore them further. But tonight, right now, you can simply rest in the wonder of it all. It's okay to let go. You've done enough thinking for one night. You've traveled far enough through time and mystery and human history. The ancient civilizations, whether erased or surviving, they had their moment. And you have yours. Here, now, safe in the darkness, part of the ongoing story of humanity trying to understand itself. Rest now. Let the questions drift away like boats on dark water. Let yourself sink into the softness and the safety and the perfect stillness of this moment. You're exactly where you need to be. Everything that needed to happen to bring you to this point has already happened. And now you can rest. You've earned it. Sweet dreams.